I'm the Dolphin of France. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 76. Who is fooling whom? Naturally, Joseph did not squeeze in with the ordinary audience. Instead, he was escorted by the guards and entered the theater directly through the VIP channel point. Is seated in a luxurious box on the third floor of the theater facing the stage. It is very spacious inside and can accommodate 12 people. But now he is the only one sitting here. As the audience entered one after another, the music sounded all around, and the curtain of the stage slowly opened. The setting on the stage is a light grey castle. In the castle, a blonde boy wearing a blue double-breasted coat was carving runes on a conical glass bottle. Colorful mist suddenly rolled up in the bottle. The old man in the robe in front of him took a look and said in an indifferent voice, "Thank you for the gift of the element. My dear Hunter's Arrow, I'm sorry that you have only reached the third level of alchemy." There were sarcastic voices all around. Oh, did my ears deceive me? Our genius is only level 3. He must have been spurned by the element. He has made no progress for many years. I never thought a genius would fall so quickly. Joseph did not expect that. Except for the exaggerated expressions, these actors were actually pretty good in other aspects. As he was concentrating on admiring them, he heard someone knocking on the door of the box. Eamon glanced outside, leaned into Joseph's ear and said, "Your Highness, you are the British ambassador. Please, let him in." Immediately, the box door opened, and a middle-aged man wearing a grey-black robe with extremely thin lips took off his hat and bowed to Joseph. "Dear His Royal Highness, I didn't expect to meet you here. I'm so lucky. You may not know me yet, but my name is David Hartley, the current British ambassador to France. Of course, I'm here to visit you today in a private capacity." Joseph nodded to him. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Ambassador. Please take a seat." Hartley sat down at the backside of the box, from a position where he could not be seen from other boxes. As the ambassador of a country, it is actually very inappropriate for him to meet with the French Crown Prince in private. If word spread, it may even cause diplomatic disputes. "Dear His Royal Highness the Crown Prince, I can often hear people praising you." Hartley smiled and said, "The talents of the son of the gods shock the world. He is extremely kind and full of wisdom." After blowing a lot of rainbow farts at the beginning, the British ambassador then continued, "Your Highness, you know that I have always advocated the firm development of the traditional friendship between Britain and France." Joseph's eyelids twitched, and he thought that Britain and France still have traditional friendship. "You mean the kind of friendship where you spend all your time digging up each other's ancestral graves?" Katri is worthy of being a veteran politician, and his lies were extremely sincere. However, in the past, due to the instigation of some careerists, the two countries had a lot of friction. This is very regrettable. Even now, there are still a lot of people who don't want to see our friendship. He glanced at Joseph and said tentatively, "So, I think we should work harder to promote this valuable friendship. What do you think?" Joseph didn't know what medicine he was selling in his gourd, so he followed his words and said, "Yes, long live the friendship between Britain and France." Hartley's eyes lit up. He did not regard the 13-year-old boy in front of him as an old fox at all. He thought to himself, this crown prince is indeed pro-British, and the information is correct. He talked about the broad prospects of British-French cooperation, changed the subject, and said, "Your Highness, in fact, I have always had a proposal that is beneficial to both our countries." Joseph showed interest. "Oh, please elaborate." Hartley sat up straight. "I heard that His Highness once strongly opposed the waste of money to build large warships. I fully agree with this." Joseph's eyes narrowed. This was something discussed at the cabinet meeting. How could the British get the news? "It seems that we need to investigate the issue of the mole." Hartley continued. "Actually, there are some guys in the UK who keep advocating building warships and wasting tax money. I think there is no need to waste this money. As long as everyone stops building warships like crazy, the mutual threat will disappear. So, I suggest that we can push for the signing of a treaty to limit the scale of shipbuilding in various countries. 4. Example, the British launch no more than 5,000 tons of warships each year, and the French no more than 2,000 tons. Oh, you know, the British maritime trade is very large, and requires more ships. Of course, Spain, the Netherlands and other countries will also participate in the signing of the treaty. Joseph couldn't help but frown. Did he really treat me like a child? In history, both Emperor Kaiser and Kaiser Wilhelm II have proven with bloody lessons that, if continental European countries do not have a powerful fleet, they will be blocked to death. He asked the Navy to suspend the production of sail warships just to avoid waste. He did not expect that the British would misunderstand him as giving up the challenge to the British Navy. Seeing that Hartley was still eloquent, he immediately interrupted him and continued to the rhythm he wanted. Mr. Ambassador, the shipbuilding treaty seems a bit far away. Why don't we study the existing treaties first? Current, like the Treaty of Eden. Hartley immediately became alert. Your Highness, I think this treaty is very complete and reasonable, and there is nothing worth talking about. Yes, it is very reasonable, but there is still room for improvement. Joseph smiled. Actually, France's industrial manufacturing capabilities are very weak, and it cannot produce a large number of necessities on its own. However, high quality and low price British products are exactly what we need. But, you know, the tariffs stipulated in the Treaty of Eden are still too high, causing the prices of these goods to be inflated. The French people will spend a lot more money for this. Hartley was stunned. This is not quite right. Normally, the French are desperately trying to raise tariffs to protect their industry. The prince actually thought it was too high. He is indeed pro-British. That's right. Hartley asked cautiously, what is your suggestion? Joseph said sternly, I think we should continue the negotiations on the Treaty of Eden and further reduce tariffs. This is in the interests of our two countries. Hartley smiled. Can you tell me more specifically? First of all, the tariffs on industrial products including textiles, steel, paper, etc. should be reduced by at least half. Joseph glanced at the British ambassador's expression and added, in order to reflect the equality between our two countries, the United Kingdom should also treat French industrial products at the same time. Reduce. Hartley nodded. Equality. Yes, you are right. Equality must be reflected. Britain's current industrial scale and technology have far surpassed France's, and it is not afraid of competition from French industrial products. In his view, even if Britain's import tariffs on industrial products were reduced to zero, it would have no impact. Seeing that he was holding back his excitement, Joseph knew that he could close the net. But, you know, if I want to promote treaty negotiations, I must first shut the mouths of those guys in the country. What they like to say all day long is damaging to France interests, so I would like to change the approach, such as temporarily increasing France's industrial product tariffs to 25%, and then lowering it year by year, reaching 5% within 7 years. In this way, they will get short-term benefits, and will not be so resistant. The current Treaty of Eden stipulates that France's industrial product tariffs are between 12% and 15%. According to this model, it will only take 3 years to reduce to the current level. Thanks to Mr. R_Island for the huge reward of 10,000 points for this book. This is the largest single reward I have received so far. The young author is so grateful that he can only add more to express his gratitude. It may take a few days to add more, but I will definitely remember it. Chapter 77 Attack. Hartley made some calculations in his mind. According to this method, France's tariffs will fall below 10% in less than 5 years. French industry will never be able to turn around. When the tariff is reduced to 5%, France will become a dumping ground for goods, almost like the British colonies. He suppressed his excitement, hid his trembling hands behind his back, and said, I will report this to the Parliament. But I personally think your suggestions are very useful. Joseph was also relieved. If the current tariff level is adopted, French industry will soon be overwhelmed by British goods. The 25% tariff can give various workshops a breath of relief. When he has a political foundation, he will start to promote France's industrial revolution. I have the technology and ideas of later generations. If it takes 7 years for French industry to surpass that of Britain, I might as well buy a piece of cheese and kill it. When France completes the enhanced version of the Industrial Revolution, it will be France that dumps goods to Britain, which has extremely low tariffs. After deceiving the industry, it was time for Joseph to collect interest. Mr. Ambassador, France has made huge concessions on industrial tariffs. So, should the UK also make a concession on agricultural products? Hartley nodded immediately and said, that's no problem. The tariff on wine can still be negotiated. In the last trade negotiation, the French were most concerned about wine exports, and they actually exchanged most of their industrial products market for the British wine market. Joseph smiled and said, actually, in addition to wine, we also have some breweries in Normandy, and there seems to be some spirits. It is best if the tariff on these wines can be reduced to less than 10%. By the way, luxury goods and luxury goods. Maybe you have heard that I have some luxury goods industries. If you can make it easier, I will be deeply grateful. Hartley thought for a moment and then nodded. I will definitely convey your intention to the Parliament. The quality of French beer is very average, and the sales volume of spirits is even less. The British market can be open to them. The market for luxury goods is not too big either. Compared with the huge profits from industrial products, these are not even a fraction. I'm glad that we can reach a consensus with you. Joseph said, both of us must promote the resumption of trade negotiations as soon as possible. Hartley thought of another question. Your Highness, what you just said is your personal idea, or does it represent my opinion only? However, I believe that this will also be the terms proposed by the French negotiating delegation. Hartley nodded, raised the wine glass on the table, and signaled to Joseph for the prosperous Anglo-French trade. But, he secretly thought, it may be difficult for the Crown Prince's political power alone to completely influence the content of the negotiations. I would suggest that Parliament mobilize British resources in France to help him achieve this, even if negotiations cannot be concluded in a short period of time. As long as the French Crown Prince has this idea, a new treaty will be signed sooner or later. Joseph raised his glass and clinked it with him, and happened to hear Hunter's IO on the stage shout loudly, 30 years east of the Seine, 30 years west of the Seine. Don't bully a young man because of his poverty. The impassioned words made all the audience stand up and applaud vigorously, and some were even moved to tears. Then, I won't interrupt your enjoyment of the wonderful drama. Hartley stood up, bowed, and left. He was already thinking in his mind that, if the negotiation conditions mentioned by the French Crown Prince were met, as a hero, he might be able to compete for the next Prime Minister. As for the preset goal of this trip, to promote the shipbuilding treaty, he had long forgotten about it. The next day. The conference hall of the East Palace of the Palace of Versailles will hold the first cabinet meeting after the tax bill was rejected by the High Court. Joseph walked into the main entrance of the Golden Hall and put away the several pages of reports in his hands. That was the investigation report just sent by Fouche. It was mentioned that they found the mistress of the former police chief Gizzard, a woman named Anna. With Gizzard's arrest, Anna became impoverished. Finally, under the seduction of a spy from the police intelligence service, she revealed that Gizzard and Similian had discussed at her residence how to disrupt the Saint Antoine district and cause trouble for the Dauphin. The point is that in the conversation between Gizzard and the two, it was mentioned that if something happened, a big man would help clean it up. Anna visited Gizzard after his arrest. Gizzard told her to go to Leverbet, the Paris municipal commissioner, saying that he would try to help him. Although there is no conclusive evidence, it is basically certain that the person behind Gizzard is Louisville. Louisville's political faction belongs to the line of the Duke of Orleans. He himself had no conflict of interest with Joseph. It can be inferred from this that the mastermind behind the scenes should be the Duke of Orleans. In addition, Fouche also found that before Joseph took over as assistant to the Minister of Finance, the Duke of Orleans had attended a cocktail party hosted by a banking guild and publicly asked banks to delay the 6 million livre loan to the government as much as possible. Since there were many people attending the reception, the news was easy to get. Therefore, the Duke of Orleans is responsible for everything. Joseph's eyes were cold. He must find a way to eradicate this scourge, otherwise he might not cause any trouble to himself in the future. Soon, Queen Mary came to the meeting hall. Everyone saluted respectfully. The cabinet meeting officially begins as the chief minister, Brian, was about to summarize the important matters during this period as usual, when he saw the Minister of Justice Samuel and the Duke of Orleans look at each other, then suddenly stood up and said loudly, "Archbishop Brian, the most important thing for France right now is to advance the tax bill. I think everyone is waiting for you to introduce the progress of this matter." Brian's face suddenly darkened. It is well known that the High Court rejected the bill, and the Minister of Justice asked this question here, which is obviously a provocation and insult to himself. He suppressed his anger and said in a deep voice, "The High Court has refused to register. However, I have adjusted the terms of the bill and will submit it to the High Court again." Soumaya smiled. "The bill you submitted last time seriously targeted all nobles, which is why it was rejected. How are you going to adjust it this time? Target the military, or directly target the royal family?" Soumaya continued, "As far as I know, the High Court has reached a consensus and will refuse to cooperate with you. In other words, any subsequent bills submitted by you will definitely be rejected." As he spoke, he looked at Queen Mary and raised his tone. "Your Majesty the Queen, I believe that for the sake of France's financial stability, the candidate for finance minister should be changed to ensure that the tax bill can be passed as soon as possible." Before the Queen could say anything, Foreign Minister Versin stood up and stroked his chest. "I agree with Count Soumaya's suggestion. The national finances are on the verge of collapse, and Archbishop Brian should be responsible for this. Thanks to the big guys, White Knight returns to dust, and B Mountain for their generous rewards for this book. Your support is the motivation for me to code. The young author would like to express my gratitude." Chapter 78 Attack and Defense Battle. Soumaya bowed to the Queen and signaled, "Your Majesty, I also have the Duke of Seville, the Count of Serralia, and the Marquis of Saint Villain." He named a dozen names in one breath. All of them were very influential nobles, commissioned to express to you their position in recommending the resignation of Archbishop Brian. Vilsin glanced at Brian and said, "There are discussions everywhere in Paris now about Archbishop Brian's lack of financial knowledge and outdated financial policies." Queen Mary did not expect that so many people wanted Brian to step down, and said with some hesitation, "The tax bill is very complicated. Perhaps Archbishop Brian should be given more time. The Duke of Orleans has long been planning to overthrow Brian, and launching an attack at this time will certainly not give him a chance to delay his breath." He coughed slightly, stood up and said, "Your Majesty the Queen, I have some friends in the banking industry. They told me that, because the assistant to the finance minister interrupted loan cooperation with two banks for no reason a while ago, the banks suffered serious losses. There has been strong dissatisfaction with the state's fiscal policy across the banking industry in recent times. In order to deal with Brian, he just dumped what Joseph did to Brian. But this makes sense. After all, Brian is the top person in charge of the financial system, and he should be responsible for all financial issues." Soumaya put on a shocked expression very cooperatively and said, "This situation sounds very serious." "That's right." The Duke of Orleans also pretended to be worried. "A friend revealed to me that the banking association may boycott Archbishop Brian, which will seriously affect the government's access to loans." He looked at Queen Mary. "Your Majesty, you know that without the support of bank loans, we will not be able to repay the national debt, which is a national debt default. In fact, he is completely alarmist. For bank capital, lending to the government is the best deal. Not only is the interest rate high, but there is basically no need to worry about the loan not being repaid." Bank Laval and Laborde had lost their government loan business, which immediately caused their revenue to plummet, making them as anxious as ants on a hot pot. Queen Mary became a little uneasy, frowned and asked, "What should I do? Is there any room for redemption, perhaps?" Duke Orleans thought hard for a moment, then suddenly raised his head and said, "There is someone who can cope with the current situation." The Queen asked anxiously, "Who is he?" "Actually, you also know him, Mr. Necker," said the Duke of Orleans. "He has always had good relations with the banking industry and has rich experience in financial management. I believe that he is the most suitable candidate to be the finance minister at the moment. Versin and Sumire immediately nodded in agreement. Mr. Necker does have the ability to solve these problems. I also feel that he is the only one who can serve as finance minister. Queen Mary looked at the three people who were worried about the country and the people and kept making impassioned speeches, and she sighed secretly in her heart. In fact, she was quite dissatisfied with Brian's work. After taking over the financial system, the country's huge debt has not been reduced at all. It's been more than half a year since the tax bill came up, and there's still no progress. Now we have offended the banking industry again. The reason why she wanted to use Brian as the finance minister was because Brian was the speaker of the Conference of Notables who represented the great nobles at that time. Winning him over would help the Conference of Notables support the new tax bill. Unexpectedly, as soon as Brian showed his attitude of supporting the royal family, he was immediately abandoned by the meeting of dignitaries. It can be said that in terms of political games, he has basically lost value. If replacing him can help advance the tax bill and gain support from the banking industry, it is not impossible to consider. Moreover, Necker had previously served as finance minister. Although he was dismissed for privately announcing the royal family's spending, he was indeed very professional in financial management. Thinking of this, the Queen raised her eyes and looked at the other ministers. So, what are your opinions on this matter? Joseph had been somewhat unresponsive by the sudden attack by the Minister of Justice and the Duke of Orleans and others. At this time, he finally understood that they were going to get rid of Brian and help Necker come to power. Historically, Necker did replace Brian as Chancellor just a few months later. It can be said that using this person as finance minister ruined Louis XVI's last hope of saving his life. Very simply, Necker represents the interests of capitalists. To be precise, bank capital. How could he serve the royal family sincerely? It was during his tenure as finance minister that the French government's borrowings from banks rapidly expanded several times, even though Carlin, the later finance minister, worked hard to avoid high interest loans. France's finances had become dependent on loans and there was no way back. In addition, he privately announced the royal family's expenditures, causing France to fiercely criticize the royal family's huge expenditures. In fact, a large part of this is the government's expenditure on repurchasing the fiefdoms of the great nobles. Real royal expenses basically come from the king's own estates and properties, and the king has to supplement the national treasury deficit from time to time with private property. Joseph narrowed his eyes slightly. He would never let the Duke of Orleans get what he wanted. His plan to promote the tax bill has just begun to take shape, and he needs Brian's cooperation. At this time, he must be kept, and it is also a sniper against Necker. He stood up immediately and said, actually, Archbishop Brian was very effective in promoting the tax bill. You can go to Paris and see. Most people think that nobles should pay land tax and so on, and they are very supportive of the new tax bill, although what he said was a bit exaggerated. Similar public opinions have indeed begun to appear in large numbers. Sumire looked over at him. Your Majesty the Crown Prince, as far as I know, there are still many people who are skeptical of the tax bill. Joseph smiled disdainfully, but there will be fewer and fewer as sales of his two newspapers continue to rise. Public opinion was bound to tilt in favor of the bill. Moreover, the content of the bill has little impact on most people, and it can improve government finances. There is no reason why people should not support it. No, Your Highness, the tax bill has been opposed for a long time, and people will never. Joseph did not want to get entangled with him on these minor issues. The other party is obviously well prepared. If you get caught up in detailed discussions, you will get into the other party's rhythm. Joseph immediately raised his hand to interrupt him and said to Queen Mary, Your Majesty, Archbishop Brian has actually made a complete plan to promote the tax bill and has begun to implement it. Here, I can tell you with certainty that the tax bill will definitely be registered in the High Court in 2 months at most. Everyone present was stunned. They didn't expect Brian to be so confident. Brian was also confused. Why didn't he know about this plan? But he immediately realized that His Highness the Crown Prince was helping him. Because the editor said that the follow-up reading of this book is stuck on the edge of being recommended by Shang Sanjiang, so I want to try my best to rush forward. Could Cheyenne Haitian ask readers to help spread this book? I hope to add more readers and follow-up reading so that Shang Sanjiang will be stable. Please, readers, recommend this book to your friends or help promote the book on other platforms. Cheyenne Haitian is here to beg you. If this book can be recommended by Sanjiang, I will add 2 more chapters as a thank you gift. Chapter 79 Declaration of War. De Sumiel and Verzin immediately looked towards the Duke of Orleans. They had made a careful plan, but they did not expect this situation point according to the usual pattern of political struggle. When they suddenly attack, the unprepared Brian can only have 2 responses. First, he accepted the defeat and directly announced his resignation. Second, he tried to shirk the blame and wait until the cabinet meeting was over before looking for political help to break the situation point, and I have long been prepared to mobilize more nobles and unite the banking industry to put pressure on the Queen. What awaits Brian in the end is still the fate of being dismissed. However, who knew Brian would actually fight back on the spot? The Duke of Orleans frowned and said coldly, Archbishop Brian, you were unable to do anything to promote the tax bill before. How come you are so confident all of a sudden? France's financial situation is already extremely serious, and if you still fail to get the bill passed in 2 months. Brian glanced at Joseph out of the corner of his eye, and when he saw his affirmative look, he immediately became worried and said loudly, Duke Orleans, how do you know that the previous few times were not my tests of the High Court, and the bill was rejected? It's also part of my overall plan. He is also a veteran in politics, telling the truth and lies at the drop of a hat. He looked at Queen Mary again and said resolutely, Your Majesty, if the tax bill has not been registered in 2 months, please exile me to Corsica. France has a tradition of exiling high-ranking officials who have made mistakes, but they are usually exiled to remote towns such as Lorraine or Perpignan. Exiling to an island outside the mainland is a very serious punishment. In fact, Brian had expected that he would be dismissed sooner or later, and he was originally prepared to accept it calmly, but for some reason, he had a hunch at that moment that the Crown Prince could really get the bill passed. He was not willing to let his political life end, so he immediately made a decision: believe in the Crown Prince and take a big gamble. Seeing the hesitation in the Queen's eyes, the Duke of Orleans immediately said loudly, There is no need to waste another 2 months. Mr. Necker should be asked to save France's finances immediately. Joseph smiled calmly and said, May I ask the Duke of Orleans, is Mr. Necker confident that the tax bill will be passed within 2 months? The Duke of Orleans hesitated. He himself was one of the masterminds behind blocking the tax bill, so he could only shake his head. Probably not. Joseph immediately turned to the Queen. Your Majesty the Queen, since Mr. Necker can't do it, what reason do we have for not giving the confident Archbishop Brian a chance? Orleans said anxiously, Your Majesty, Archbishop Brian will only make the financial situation continue to worsen. Joseph immediately said, only by passing the tax bill can the financial situation be improved, and Mr. Necker can't do anything about it. In fact, he also knew that charging more taxes from the nobles would only be better than nothing for the French finance. But whether this bill is passed or not is an important symbolic event in the contest between the royal power and the big aristocratic group. Whoever loses will be severely defeated on the political battlefield. Therefore, this bill must be passed. Seeing the tit-for-tat confrontation between the two, Queen Mary couldn't help but rub her brows tiredly. The weight of these national events was still too heavy for a woman like her. Her eyes wandered back and forth between Joseph and the Duke of Orleans. Although the former seemed to make more sense, the latter was a minister with rich political experience, and his opinions might be more worthy of reference. She then thought of Brian's confident look, as if he really had a chance to win, but the attitudes of the great nobles in the meeting of nobles and the banking industry also had to be considered. She just felt that various factors were in a melee in her head, and she didn't know who to listen to for a while. For a long time, Queen Mary looked to other cabinet ministers for help. What do you think of this matter? None of the neutral cabinet ministers wanted to take sides rashly, so they all bowed their heads and remained silent. Home Secretary Mono opened his mouth but ultimately said nothing. Seeing that no one said anything, the Queen looked at the Duke of Orleans and Brian again, and finally folded her hands feebly on the conference table in front of her, and said softly, then, whether Archbishop Brian will continue to be responsible for financial affairs until the two regarding the matter a few months later, I urge you to make a fair judgment, based on the common interests of all France. I have decided to temporarily adjourn the meeting and continue to hold a cabinet meeting tomorrow to make a cabinet decision on this matter. The resolution she refers to is a collective vote by cabinet ministers on difficult to decided government affairs. After she made the announcement, as if she had exhausted all her strength, she motioned for the meeting to end and took the lead in walking towards the golden door with the support of the maid. Joseph frowned secretly. He did not expect that the Queen was so lacking in decision making and courage that she actually left the problem to her ministers. The Duke of Orleans gave Brian a proud look, said nothing, and left the conference hall with his group of people. The two sides have declared war, and there is little room for compromise. All that is left is to use their own methods to engage in political compromise. Joseph and Brian came to the Chancellor's office together. After closing the door, Brian immediately leaned forward and said, "Thank you for your help, Your Highness. You saved me and France's finances." Then, he eagerly asked the question he was most concerned about. "Please tell me the truth. Are you really sure that the bill will be passed?" Joseph knew that the interests of the two people were now tied together, so there was no need to worry about him leaking the secret. He immediately nodded and said, "Please rest assured, I'm sure, although the conference of dignitaries seems to be a political monster that is difficult to fight, it actually has two fatal weaknesses. First of all, it is not an extremely united whole internally, but rather the big aristocracy and the capital aristocracy. You can simply understand it as the new rich who have quickly accumulated a lot of wealth. A combination of the two. We can divide and disintegrate it. Secondly, it relies too much on the High Court. Without the support of the High Court, they are just a group of ordinary nobles without power. The High Court is corrupt and has many grounds for attack." Hearing this, Brian nodded thoughtfully and said, "Your analysis is very thorough, but we only have 2 months." Joseph immediately smiled and said, "Please rest assured. Now I have in my hands enough interests and means to divide the member of dignitaries, and I also have the tools of public opinion that can make the High Court surrender. Coupled with your political capital, as long as I operate it properly, I can use it to the bill will be passed in less than 2 months." Brian's eyes suddenly flashed with light, and until this moment, he was finally convinced that his bet was right. While the two were talking, they heard Eamon's voice. "Your Highness, Count Monad is here." Brian and Joseph looked at each other and then said loudly, "Please come in." The door is unlocked. The door was pushed open and Home Secretary Mono walked in with a serious expression. The young author is here to ask for various recommendation votes, monthly votes, collections, and further reading. The young author is grateful. Your support is the motivation for me to write. Reader group 1,036,217,580. Everyone is welcome to join the group and chat and discuss together. Chapter 80 Political Dealing. Monad bowed to Joseph and Brian and said seriously, "This cabinet decision is related to the future financial path. I'm afraid everyone will be extremely cautious about how to decide." Brian immediately smiled. "Count Monad, I heard that your child will be 15 years old soon, and is very good." He stretched out his hands towards Mono. "This may be a bit presumptuous, but I think he is indeed a good candidate to inherit your title." Mono's eyes suddenly lit up. "You mean, you have a way to help him?" He was over 60 years old, and his first wife and only son both died of illness. Although he had several illegitimate children, according to French law, illegitimate children could not inherit the family business. Brian nodded to him and said, "This will take a long time, but I think there are some ways to do it. I can promise you." Mono immediately held his hand tightly and said excitedly, "Archbishop Brian, you have always been my most respected chancellor. This will never change." He originally had some friendship with Brian, and later he had some friendship with Joseph. This time, the Crown Prince stood firmly with Brian. He has roughly determined his position, but the political rewards he deserves are still indispensable. Brian also readily took out the reward. You must know that it is not easy to operate the heir identity for the illegitimate son of an earl. Without Brian's church background and the power of his chief minister, it is almost impossible to do it. Of course, Monad also took a lot of political risks, but he also calculated very clearly that even if Brian lost, he would still get a favor from the crown prince and would not lose everything. Brian also hurriedly thanked you. Thank you for your trust, Count Monad. You will always have my friendship. After completing the blending of interests, Mono immediately began to contribute ideas and contributions to the team. Archbishop Brian, are you sure about tomorrow's resolution? Brian said truthfully, currently, only your highness and you are sure to support me. Mono mused, according to convention, soldiers generally do not participate in such things, and the Duke of Orleans has the Minister of Justice and the Minister of Foreign Affairs, also 3 people. So, Brian continued, Count Nicote's position will be particularly important. The Nicote he was talking about is now the Minister of Household Registration. A minister who usually has the least presence in the cabinet has become the focus of the storm this time. Monad lowered his head and analyzed. The Duke of Orleans should be on his way to win over him at this time. Joseph looked at him and said, what bargaining chips do you think the Duke of Orleans can bring? Monad thought for a while and said, it should be money, a large amount of money, or a manor or something. You know, the Duke of Orleans is very rich. Joseph asked again, can you tell me about Count Nicote? Well, he was once an advisor to His Majesty the King, and later became the Minister of Household Registration due to the recommendation of Viscount Carlona. However, he usually had no achievements. Behind his back, everyone called him Invisible Nico. After he finished speaking, a smile appeared on Joseph's face. I think I can go and talk to him. It was almost dusk, and Nicote respectfully followed the Dauphin as he walked slowly along the stone road at the edge of the Palace of Versailles Square. He is very aware of the current situation, and is just waiting for the 2 parties to make offers. However, he originally thought that Brian would come to find him, but he did not expect that it was the Crown Prince. Trade negotiations? Nicote looked extremely surprised. Your Highness, you mean to ask me to preside over the trade negotiations? Joseph nodded and said, yes, it won't be long before we will reopen negotiations on the Treaty of Eden with Britain. Nicote wondered, but what does this have to do with me? This kind of negotiation is usually the responsibility of the Foreign Secretary and the Finance Minister. Joseph smiled and said, that's not necessarily true. The finance minister is responsible for formulating the specific terms, and another person is responsible for coordination and communication with the British. You see, after today's cabinet meeting, it is obvious that it is difficult for Versailles and Archbishop Brian to cooperate anymore, and the finance minister must participate in the negotiations, so he can only choose another person to cooperate with Archbishop Brian. For example, you. When Nicote heard this, he couldn't help but feel moved. He presided over the negotiations with the British. The political capital he could gain from this matter was unmatched. By conducting tens of thousands of censuses on his own. The greatest political achievement of the famous Count Vergennes at that time was the promotion of the Franco-American alliance, followed by the signing of the Treaty of Eden. Could it be that I also have a chance to gain the prestige of Count Vergennes? Thinking of this, he was suddenly startled and said with some hesitation, but, Your Highness, I have no experience in this area. Joseph immediately said, this is easy. You just need to maintain the dignity of France in front of the British. I know that you have very good abilities, but you just haven't had the chance to show them. If you can let everyone see your diplomatic talents during this negotiation, you may even have a chance to be transferred to the Foreign Secretary. Nicote's breathing became a little faster, not just because the foreign minister had more authority, but more importantly, because he was tired of the household registration system, no eye-catching opportunities, the same documents and data, and even being laughed at. It is transparent. But the Foreign Secretary can use the whole world as a stage to dance freely among countries. How free and heroic he is. He looked at Joseph and asked seriously, Your Highness, Are you sure the trade agreement will be renegotiated? Pretty sure. You can ask the British ambassador to France for more information. Then, Archbishop Brian will lead the negotiations with me. What I convey is exactly what the Archbishop himself meant. Joseph always kept smiling when he heard Monad mention that Nicote's family was very well off, but he had no sense of presence in the cabinet and was quite dissatisfied with it. He knew what to trade with him. Sure enough, Nicote stopped and turned around, stroking his chest and saying, "Your Highness, you will get the vote you expected." Joseph nodded with satisfaction and added, "Count Nicote, I would like to remind you one last thing. If Archbishop Brian resigns as finance minister, then it will be Necker and Vilsin who will preside over the trade negotiations." Nicote immediately said firmly, "Yes, Your Highness, I will never let such a thing happen." Compared with the temptation of the position of foreign minister, the hundreds of thousands of livres promised to him by the Duke of Orleans were nothing at all. Joseph said goodbye to Nicote and walked towards the Palace of Versailles, sighing in his heart. Politics is simply like a transaction among market vendors. Someone bids, someone counterbids, and the one with the highest price wins. There are also people who understand the buyer psychology and can ask for high prices, or maybe you are very strong and just buy and sell by force. But at the end of the day, it's still a transaction. I recommend a friend's new book, The New World Governor's Illustrated Book of Beast-Eared Girls. Author, generally lovely Caesar easy adventure, with many girls from other worlds. Freak and gospel. Introduction. He traveled through time and became the ruling son of the Republic. He was exiled to a new continent far away from the center of power and became the governor of a colony. How will Kyoan choose? Facing a new world full of centaur girls, cat girls and mermaids, Kyoan suddenly felt that the power of the Republic was not so important. Now that you are the governor, can't you just lie back and enjoy the good fortune? Kishingu. Everyone is welcome to read and collect. Chapter 81 Betrayer. At 9 o'clock in the morning, in the conference hall of the East Palace of Versailles, the cabinet meeting to decide the fate of France was reconvened. Then, let's start the cabinet decision now. Queen Mary looked around at the people on both sides of the large conference table. "Gentlemen, those who agree with Count Suma's proposal and believe that Archbishop Brian should resign immediately, please express your opinion." The Duke of Orleans immediately showed a proud smile and slowly raised his right hand. He is absolutely sure of overthrowing Brian. Yesterday he promised Nicote a full 300,000 livres, a huge amount of money that will definitely make this transparent minister excited. Sumiel and Versin also raised their hands one after another. There was silence in the hall for a moment. The Duke of Orleans glanced at Nicote and indicated with his eyes what he should do. But there was no response. The Duke of Orleans frowned, coughed dryly, and whispered, "Ahem, Count Nicote." But Nicote just looked intently at the Queen sitting at the head of the conference table, as if he didn't hear anything. Queen Mary looked around again and asked, "Is there any more?" Seeing that Nicote was still sitting like a stone sculpture, the Duke of Orleans finally understood that something was wrong, and immediately glared at the latter viciously, as if he wanted to pierce his chest with his eyes. Queen Mary put her hands on the table, stood up, and said loudly, "According to the cabinet resolution, Archbishop Brian will continue to serve as finance minister for the next 2 months. She turned to Brian again and nodded. "I hope you can bring us good news in 2 months. If not, please remember your promise." The Queen turned and left. The Duke of Orleans turned around the conference table angrily and wanted to question the household registration minister sitting on the other side, but saw that the latter had walked out of the golden door without looking back, as if the two had never met last night. He rushed out of the conference hall in a few steps, but did not chase Nicote. Instead, he quickly walked out of the Palace of Versailles, jumped on his carriage, and gritted his teeth angrily. "Nicote, this damn betrayer, as for you, Brian, you just wasted 2 more months. There is no way the bill will be passed." Palais Royal. Several huge crystal lamps illuminated the hall, which was more than 50 meters long. In the oil painting on the wall, the old Duke of Orleans looked proudly at the middle-aged man on the wooden platform in front of him, as if listening to him report something to the regent. "We must do something." The middle-aged man, wearing a curly white wig and his face covered with acne scars shouted, waving his hands vigorously, "Everyone writes to His Majesty the King, asking Brian to step down immediately." Dozens of nobles were standing or sitting in the hall, constantly echoing loudly, "Yes, Brian has betrayed everyone here, and he will be punished. It is absolutely insulting that we should pay the same tax as those untouchables." If anyone had attended the meeting of dignitaries at the beginning of the year, they would recognize that the people present were all members of the meeting of dignitaries, that is, the most influential nobles. Beside the arched window on the west side, a man in his late 40s with a big face and a double chin whispered to the person next to him, "Such a party just happened more than 10 days ago. Why is it happening again?" The nobleman next to him said, "Count Mirabeau, don't you know about the cabinet meeting 2 days ago? I heard that Count Sumiel initiated a motion to remove Archbishop Burian, but it failed." The nobleman smiled and said, "Although she failed to remove him, the Queen asked him to get the tax bill registered within 2 months. Otherwise he will be exiled to Corsica." Mirabeau nodded slightly. Finance Minister Carlona had previously been exiled for promoting an unfavorable tax bill. If Brian failed again, it would be equivalent to announcing to all nobles that the High Court had the ability to control the power of the royal family. He also smiled. "This gathering will make us more united, and we will win in 2 months." At this moment, in a room on the 2nd floor, the Duke of Orleans glanced down at the bustling hall, turned around, raised his glass, and said with a smile, "Look, everyone is on our side." Several people in front of him also raised their glasses, and someone said, "It is the duty of the High Court to correct the mistakes of the royal family. I have seen that bill, and it is full of absurdities. I believe that no judge will allow it to be registered." "That's right. But even if Archbishop Brian significantly changes the terms, we can't let the bill pass." "That's right. This time is simply a provocation to the High Court." Orleans smiled and nodded, clinking glasses with several people enthusiastically. "These people are the most powerful judges of the High Court, and any bill that wants to be registered requires their nod. With the promises of the judges and the support of the great nobles in the hall, no matter how capable Brian was, he would have to go to Corsica in 2 months. Oh, by the way, I have prepared some surprises for everyone." The Duke of Orleans gestured to several closed doors on the side with a meaningful expression. "I hope you like it." The judges looked at each other and smiled knowingly. They knew that this was a project for the Duke of Orleans to entertain distinguished guests. The ones in that room are not ordinary skilled women, but carefully selected top-notch ones. Although it is said that they have bad origins, they are definitely rare in the world. Several people nodded their thanks to the Duke of Orleans, then picked up the mummy powder that had been prepared on the table beside them. Each chose a room and pushed the door open with a lewd smile. The pharaohs of ancient Egypt probably never dreamed that the body they had worked so hard to prepare for resurrection would be ground into powder thousands of years later and used as a sheep strengthening medicine. Paris merchant newspaper The Warehouse, which is more than 10 meters wide, is filled with the smell of ink and a faint musty smell. More than a dozen workers wearing grey-yellow coarse cloth with cracks on their faces and hands were busy tying the books into a pile with ropes and then placing them neatly on the wooden board. The books in the warehouse were piled as high as 2 people, filling half of the warehouse. Suddenly the door was pushed open. A handsome young man wearing a luxurious dark blue coat and a otter-skin 3-cornered hat walked in. The workers all saw that his status must be very noble, so they stopped what they were doing, lowered their heads nervously, and took a few steps back. The young man greeted with a smile, "Everyone, keep busy, don't worry about me." As he was talking, a supervisor wearing a felt hat, a black leather vest, and black trousers, holding a wooden stick, suddenly came over from the other side, raised his stick at the nearest worker and beat him. "Sluggard, still. Do you want to be beaten before it's time to take a break?" The supervisor took a few steps and was about to hit another worker when he looked up and saw the noble boy and the manager Dinico, who had just walked into the warehouse behind the boy. He immediately understood what was going on. He quickly bowed and saluted. "Master, I didn't bump into you, did I, Mr. Dinico? You are here." The young man is Joseph. He grabbed the supervisor's stick threw it on the ground, and said coldly, "Next time you hit someone without asking for the reason, don't do it again. This time I will fine you 3 days' wages. Thanks." 2. Chu Fengzi, Honey Mountain, Hang Mengsha Nilan, Li Xiangsha, Labalix, Rinfeke Omukru, and Book Friends 20220112192635333 for their generous rewards for this book. The young author is so grateful. HMM. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 82 Freedom Fighters. Danico hurriedly walked up and shouted to the bewildered supervisor, "What are you doing standing there in a daze? Why don't you apologize quickly? This is the boss of our newspaper." "Yes, yes." The supervisor took a few steps back nervously and bowed repeatedly. I'm very sorry, Joseph." Gestured to the workers around him. "You should apologize to them." "Ah, yes." The supervisor turned around, lowered his head to those people in simple clothes and said, "I'm sorry." Danico frowned and shook his head. "Let's go." The supervisor hurriedly fled out of the warehouse. In the process, he stepped on a rope binding a roll of books and almost fell to the ground. The workers all looked at Joseph gratefully. The brave ones even bowed to him and said, "Thank you, sir. You are such a kind and good man." Joseph noticed the cracked skin of the workers and told Danico, "Mr. Danico, please buy some lanolin and give it to everyone for free use, but be sure not to get frostbite. Also, in the coldest month of every year, we will give everyone an extra week's wages as a subsidy to keep out the cold." Danic nodded hurriedly and said, "Yes, I remember it." The workers couldn't believe their ears. They felt that this young aristocratic boss was simply the incarnation of an angel. Not only did he stop the supervisor from beating people at will, but he was also so generous to everyone. These simple workers didn't speak much and just started working again silently, but their hands were obviously much faster than before, and they were a little more careful when bundling and placing books. Joseph continued to walk forward along the gap between the books and picked up a pamphlet. He saw that the paper was gray and rough, obviously the lowest kind, and the printing was also very crude. Only the middle seam was painted with some kind of the plant fibers were simply sewn, barely able to unravel. However, this booklet has 16 pages, including 5 illustrations. He looked at the mountain-like pile of books, turned around and asked, "Mr. Danico, how many copies have been printed this time?" Danico quickly took 2 steps forward. "Your Highness, 30,000 copies of each of the 2 brochures have been printed, which should be enough to sell in Paris and surrounding towns." Joseph nodded. "How much does this volume cost? Because there are a lot of pages. It costs 1 sous and 5 deniers." Danic added, "The lithographic printing you invented is really amazing. Without it, the cost would definitely exceed 3 sous. In fact, if the previous copper plates were used for printing, no brochure would dare to have 5 illustrations. The cost of engraving copper plates would increase the cost of the brochure several times. It can be said that the brochure launched by Paris Business Daily is definitely the most luxurious benchmark in the brochure industry." Joseph said without hesitation, "Then sell it at cost price." "Yes, Your Highness." Danico has become accustomed to the boss's luxury. The last time those newspapers were priced, if shops hadn't rushed to advertise, they would have lost money. Joseph opened the booklet in his hand. The first few pages were filled with cool novels, and in the middle was an article about how much money are the judges of the High Court earning. A total of 4 such articles were included. Later in the interval between cool articles, Joseph read it roughly and found that the quality of several articles was really unsatisfactory. The writing was slow and did not arouse the reader's anger, and it was difficult to resonate. He couldn't help but frown slightly. The content of the article should be more inflammatory. Danic nodded awkwardly. "Yes, I will try my best." Joseph also knew that he could not be blamed for this. Paris Business News was just a tabloid that sold hundreds of copies before, and the editor's ability was just that. He thought for a while, pointed to the pamphlet in his hand and said, "We can make some improvements in the title first. For example, how much money are the judges of the High Court greedy for? Can be changed to angry." If they say there is no money, get away, you don't deserve to win. The following article, The Truth About Justice Vezinius' Trial of Leon's Inheritance Case, is called Shocking. A story that has to be told between a widow, two men, and Justice Vezinius. The impact of the failure to register the tax bill on the country's finances was changed to its terrible. They are taking France's money, but we don't know it. Danico's eyes suddenly widened. Speaking of which, these topics seem to be slightly related to the content of the article, but it doesn't seem to be the case. But the most important thing is that these titles are so tempting. Anyone who sees this title will definitely not be able to help but read the following articles. He sighed inwardly. If the Crown Prince became a reporter, he would be competed by major newspapers, just based on his ability to headline this story. As Joseph was talking, he saw a newspaper executive gesturing to Danico from a distance, who hurriedly said to Joseph, "Your Highness, the guest you are waiting for has arrived." Joseph nodded and came to the newspaper office with Danico. A middle-aged man with disheveled hair and deep nasolabial folds was waiting here. When he saw the two people coming in, he stood up and saluted Danico. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Danico. Thank you for publishing my article. I wonder why you came to see me." Danico immediately followed Joseph's instructions and said to the latter, "Mr. Xavier, this is Mr. Marat." He pointed to Joseph, who was wearing a three-cornered hat. "Mr. Marat, this is the boss of our newspaper, Mr. Xavier." "Oh, it was his instruction that your article was published in the newspaper." Marat hurriedly bowed to Joseph and said, "Thank you very much, Mr. Xavier. You are really young and promising, and you have managed Paris business news so well." Joseph returned the favor with a smile and gestured to the chair next to him. "Mr. Marat, please sit down." Yes, the main purpose of his coming to the newspaper office today was to meet Marat, the famous Jacobin leader in history, the god of death who could make 3,000 heads fall to the ground with just a few signatures. The article Marat wrote analyzing the tax bill met with obstacles everywhere, and finally submitted it to the Paris Business Journal. Danico needed this kind of manuscript at the time, so he published it directly. When Joseph saw Marat's name in his newspaper, he suddenly had an idea and asked Danico to make an appointment with him. Joseph knew very well that, although Marat was just a reporter with sharp writing on the surface, he was actually very energetic and well connected, and he had great influence among the people at the bottom. If done correctly, he might be able to play a big role in his battle with the High Court. However, in view of Marchachan's extremely repulsive attitude towards the royal family, he could only choose to change his identity to meet him. After Marat sat down, Danico excused himself that there was something going on in the warehouse and left. Joseph looked at Marat and smiled. "I have always admired you very much, Mr. Marat. You are a true freedom fighter." Marat was obviously very happy with this title, and he immediately bowed and said, "It is my honor to fight for justice and rights for the French people, because this book will be on the shelves tomorrow morning. The author is begging for the first order. This is very important to the book. I hope everyone can support it. The author is grateful." Chapter 83 Remarks on the launch. Dear readers, good evening. I report to you as the author. This book will be on the shelves at midnight on December 1st, 2023. The autumn wind in October was like a golden paintbrush, rendering the magnificent Palace of Versailles in the book. At that moment, I was a crown prince in France, opened a new chapter. The frost and snow in November seemed like a long and hard journey, which made me learn perseverance and patience in my continuous writing, and strive to satisfy the readers in December. Forget it, I won't learn the European accent, it's too tiring. I'd better speak bluntly. The book I Was a Dauphin in France was conceived in June, when I read a book about modern European history. After reading the book, I immediately became very interested in the history of the French Revolution. I thought that during that era of sudden changes and turbulent waves, many interesting stories and embarrassing characters were produced. So, I had a strong creative impulse, hoping to write interesting stories. To this end, I began to look through various historical documents and materials. You really don't know it until you see it, and you'll be shocked when you see it. Finding foreign historical materials is tiring and troublesome. The Chinese versions of many historical materials are lacking, and the translations of many historical celebrities are different. I made an error at first, thinking it was the name of two people, but later I found out that it was the same person's name with different transliterations in this way. After searching for more than 3 months of information, I thought that what I found was relatively comprehensive, so I started writing this book. As soon as I started writing, I found that some of the paragraphs of the previously designed outline still needed to be refined in order to write with charm. Although I write very slowly, the support from big readers such as tips, monthly tickets and recommendation tickets has never stopped, which really warms my heart and touches me. After stumbling for more than a month, I'm finally getting to the point where it is on the shelves, and I'm quite emotional. This is the third book I've written to make it to the shelf, just like my third child. Although it definitely has its shortcomings, I still love it very much. I hope you, the reader, will fall in love with it too. Finally, what I want to say is to thank the 2 editors who picked me up, Brother Mung Dao and Brother Pengley. Originally, I was worried that my book would not be easily reviewed because it was too unpopular. Unexpectedly, the 2 editors picked it up and helped me a lot. I very much hope that the subscription volume of this book will be worthy of the 2 editors' favor at the same time. I'm also grateful to the 4 helmsmen of this book, Kaiser, R. Island, and K. Shunning, who generously rewarded this book, as well as all the book lovers for their love and support for this book. I beg you all, please contribute an initial subscription to this book, because the author can't even bother to eat dinner tonight, and has been busy typing. Because this is really important to young authors, and I love you. Chapter 84 Public Opinion Boomerang. Joseph said excitedly, I have read many of your articles, and I always thought it was strange why, as a freedom fighter, you never launched an attack on the dirtiest, most corrupt, and darkest places in Paris. It wasn't until I read your article that I realized I wrongly blamed you. Mera blinked in confusion. What is the most corrupt and dark place you are talking about? Joseph clenched his fists and said, of course it's the High Court. It's full of money and power transactions, and unjust cases are being made all the time. The judges regard the suffering of the victims as a means of getting rich. That's where all the suffering of the Paris people comes from. He did not slander the High Court at all. There are a lot of records in later generations that the High Court at this time was the most corrupt place in France, because judges have gradually become hereditary and their authority has become more and more important. Winning or losing in lawsuits has completely become a competition of bribing judges. As a result, when many people at the bottom encounter problems, they would rather go to gangs for help instead of going to court. It wasn't until the emperor came to power and severely rectified the judiciary that the courts began to become cleaner. Mera frowned. He was very well informed and naturally knew about the dirty deeds in the High Court. Compared with the High Court, the bureaucrats in other departments are as pure as underage girls. Joseph continued, your article was so well written. It denounced the High Court's shameless obstruction of the tax bill and exposed the dirty deal between them and the nobles. Mera couldn't help feeling a little ashamed after hearing this. In his article, he only mentioned that the bill would be beneficial to the country's finances. The court did not have sufficient reasons to reject it. There must be a hidden reason for rejecting the registration 3 times in a row. But it was far from the level of denunciation that Mr. Xavier said. Joseph seemed to be minding his own speech. Since the High Court has the power to review publications, no newspaper has ever dared to expose their ugliness, but I decided to declare war on them. Even if my newspaper is shut down, even if I'm in jail, I will never regret it. At least the respected Mr. Merritt fought side by side with me. Listening to his impassioned declaration, Mera suddenly felt like a coward. Because I knew subconsciously that writing about the High Court would be difficult to pass the publication review, so I unconsciously avoided this aspect. How much ugliness and injustice was buried under lies. Because of this cowardice. Young Mr. Xavier is the real fighter. Joseph looked at Mera's expression and thought that success or failure depended on this. He took a deep breath and said, Mr. Merritt, I know that this is very dangerous. Even if you choose to retreat, I can definitely understand. But I will continue to fight to the end for the French people. Mera felt a surge of hot blood rushing to the top of her head, stood up suddenly, clenched her fists hard, and said seriously, I will fight with you to expose the crimes of the High Court, return judicial justice and dignity to the people. In the western suburbs of Paris. The police intelligence officers stationed point accompanied by Fouche and other senior police officers. Joseph quickly passed by the room with signs such as intelligence team, operation team, resource team and other signs, and walked into the supervisor's office at the end of the corridor. The police intelligence unit is growing rapidly. Fouche had just given him a brief report. Now there are more than 400 police officers in the entire police information division. Informants are spread all over Paris. Important departments such as City Hall, courts, and embassies have established entire intelligence networks to collect and summarize intelligence on time every day. Point at present, when it comes to intelligence acquisition capabilities, the secret police, which has 7 or 8 times more people, can't even claim to be better than the police intelligence unit. Joseph sat down at the desk. First praised Fouche and others for their excellent work, and then began to assign tasks. The police intelligence division must investigate the corruption and criminal situations of the high court justices and important officials within 1 month. In fact, he could just send someone to tell Fouche about these matters, but it was related to his political future, so he decided to come to the police intelligence office in person to show that he took it seriously. There are also the Duke of Seville and the Count of Serralia. He looked at the note in his hand and read out a dozen names in succession, all of which were mentioned by Salmiel at the cabinet meeting, and supported the removal of Brian. Great nobleman. These people must also be investigated carefully. Whether they are raping women, evading taxes, or even injuring servants, we will investigate everything we can. Yes, Your Highness. Joseph named another block and house number, and said to Fouche, "This is Muller's address." Fouche said doubtfully, "That Jean Paul Marat, a die-hard anti-royalist." Joseph nodded. "Currently, he is considered one of our own. You can ask your subordinates to take the initiative, to be his informants and hand over to him the black materials found in the High Court." He had just successfully guided Marat, the piranha, to swim towards the High Court. Only when the prey has some wounds will the piranha bite more violently. Paris Superior Court. In the Justice Lounge on the 2nd floor, Justice Vezinier threw a wad of newspapers at the face of the official in front of him and said angrily, "What on earth are you doing? Let something like this pass press censorship." The official carefully picked up the newspaper and unfolded it. He saw that it was a copy of Paris Business News, and the headline on the front page was "The Harm of Hereditary Judges of the High Court." He frowned and looked at the news and pictures at the back. The front page was discussion on the scope of the power of the High Court. He hurriedly defended, "Count Vezinier, there is nothing wrong with these articles. I read them carefully yesterday. Although there are some suggestive or misleading contents." The judge with a hooked nose next to Vezinier frowned and said, "You sure?" The official in charge of press censorship muttered, "Maybe I can ask them to change the title." Vezinier said with a sullen face, "Your review standards can be stricter." The official immediately lowered his head and responded, "Yes, sir, I will definitely not let similar articles appear again." Vezinier turned to the judge beside him. "Let Reen take people to this newspaper office and find any reason to shut him down." "You are right. I will give him orders right now." 2 hours later, more than 30 publishing police officers armed with sticks and shields surrounded the front and back doors of the Paris Merchant newspaper office. Although the publishing police are called police, they are not under the management of the police department. They are like bailiffs, and are dispatched by the court. Rene, the leader of the publishing police, led a few people, strode into the newspaper office, pulled over a worker, and asked sternly, "Who's in charge here?" The worker pointed gingerly to Dinico's office. Reen pushed him away, rushed straight into the office, pointed at Dinico and shouted, "Are you the person in charge here? Let everyone gather in the open space over there immediately. I want to conduct a comprehensive inspection." However, before Dinico could answer, Rene heard a whistle coming from outside the newspaper office. Reen turned around and saw more than a dozen policemen in blue uniforms running in formation with whistles blowing. He stepped forward in confusion and raised his hat in salute to the leading policeman. "Excuse me, are you trying to arrest a criminal?" The policeman glanced at him and said coldly, "What are you doing?" Rene took out the court documents. "There may be contraband in this newspaper office, and I was ordered to come and search it." The leading policeman turned a blind eye and said, Have your people leave the newspaper office immediately. Rene blinked and held up the court documents again. I'm executing the order, please. The leading policeman waved his hand, and the policemen behind him immediately lined up in 2 lines. The front row pointed at the publishing police with anti-explosion crotches. The people in the back row opened the bolts of their muskets. Rene looked at the black muzzle of the gun, shrank his neck in fright, and still shouted inwardly, "What do you want to do?" The leading policeman smiled. "My mission is to prevent any outsiders from affecting the operation of the newspaper. Please get out immediately." Rene still wanted to struggle, but saw another group of police officers arriving and surrounding the publishing police at the door. The publishing police under him usually did things like search for banned books and seal newspapers. They did not dare to be aggressive with the security police, and they all gathered together very obediently. Rene nodded hurriedly. Okay, let's just leave immediately." He led dozens of his men and retreated from the newspaper office in despair. Joseph expected that the High Court would use despicable means to deal with the newspaper, so he had already said hello to Bassance and the latter built a security booth directly opposite the newspaper office and doubled the number of patrol police in nearby neighborhoods, asking them to ensure the normal operation of the newspaper office. After Rene went back to report the situation and was scolded by his immediate boss, he had no choice but to bring more publishing police to the newspaper office. However, he found that there were already police outside the newspaper office with guns drawn, and they could not even get close to the door. The next day, several articles in Paris Business and News and Pictures failed to pass the censorship, so they had to temporarily fill the empty pages with some innocuous articles. In the afternoon of that day, a large number of pamphlets published articles that failed to pass censorship, accompanied by a commentary article titled "The High Court Tramples on the Freedom of the Press." The title on the front page of another brochure is "Shock. Published Police Violent Break-in." The purposes. The main contents of the 2 pamphlets were wonderful and refreshing articles, and the price was very cheap. Tens of thousands of copies were quickly sold and spread throughout the streets of Paris. 2 days later, after the contents of the pamphlet had fermented, journalists and people from the publishing industry appeared in front of the High Court to protest, demanding that freedom of the press not be interfered with. The article of Paris Business did not contain prohibited content and should pass censorship. Other reporters began to give speeches on the streets, criticizing the High Court for using violence and threatening a newspaper that had no problems. The people of Paris have long been extremely dissatisfied with the corrupt High Court. Many people gathered around the speaker, enthusiastically agreed and discussed, and cheered loudly from time to time. Although according to regulations, Paris prohibits unapproved speeches, the Paris police were ordered to turn a blind eye to any speech involving the High Court and not interfere. Begging for the first order. The author is very grateful. I will try my best to add more updates today. I only ask for the first subscription. Chapter 85 Gene-derived skills. Paris, Saint-Germain district. A salon was being held in a luxurious villa on the east side of Saint-Germain Avenue. The owner of the villa, Mrs. Varville, listened to the guests' philosophical words and clapped gently intoxicatedly from time to time. The servants brought plates of snacks and fruits in front of each guest, or filled empty wine glasses with expensive wine. After several young people gave their warm-up speeches, a middle-aged man with disheveled hair stood up and received a round of cheers from the guests before he spoke. "Mr. Mayor, I'm just waiting to hear your opinion. The highlight of today is here, Mr. Merritt. Your report was so well written that I read it several times." Everyone, be quiet and let Mr. Merritt say. Mayor smiled and touched her chest, then raised her right hand and said loudly, "Today, I want to talk about the most decadent and darkest place in Paris, that is the High Court." Everyone should have heard that just 2 days ago, they sent publishing police to harass the office of Paris Business for no reason, and even tried to seal it down. Those lunatics, filthy maggots. They use the power of censorship to prevent many truth-revealing articles from being published by the Paris handles. They are the enemies of freedom. Those sanctimonious judges think that newspapers and books and periodicals are playthings that can be manipulated at will, and that they can control people's thoughts. His speech was sharp, and his tone and demeanor were extremely contagious. In terms of his ability to incite emotions, his combat effectiveness was absolutely explosive. Dozens of people sitting around him expressed their approval from time to time and applauded warmly. These people are all very influential journalists in Paris, and Merit is the most authoritative opinion leader in this circle. After Merit set the tone with a brilliant speech, the whole salon was about bashing the High Court. Mrs. Varvel urged the recorders with admiration to write down all the speeches. Merit picked up the wine in front of him and made a gesture of approval to the reporter, who was giving a speech. Then he turned to the young reporter sitting on the right with his hair blown up and sharp eyes and whispered, "Viscount Desmoulins, my old friend, we haven't seen each other for a long time." Desmoulins nodded respectfully. "Yes, I haven't seen you for more than half a year. I always wanted to visit you, but I was afraid of disturbing you." Merit smiled and said, "You know you're always welcome. By the way, I remember you were a judge on the High Court for a few years, right?" Desmoulins' face turned red, and he said angrily, "Yes, there is such a thing. Just, as you said, it was a dirty place. I couldn't stand it, so I resigned and became a reporter. My father every time I meet, everyone will scold me for this." Merit's voice became even lower. "Then you should know a lot about those corrupt judges, right?" Desmoulins said, "No, I know a lot. I even left some certificates and evidence." Merit's eyes suddenly lit up, and he said solemnly, "We must be like soldiers and bravely expose the crimes of those guys to the people." Desmoulins nodded seriously. I listen to you. Yes, by the way, I also know a few friends who have worked in the court. They must also want to do something." Just one day later, a large number of manuscripts were sent from Desmoulins' apartment to various newspapers in Paris. Unlike previous articles that analyze the pros and cons of the court system or criticize the courts for interfering with freedom of the press, this article contains real cases. There are countless cases of high court judges being corrupt and accepting bribes, causing numerous tragedies. Not only is the description of the case clear, but the writing is also very provocative, and it seems to be written by an author at first glance. Naturally, this kind of thing would not be published in a newspaper, but the team that produced the brochure felt like a treasure and began to type and print it overnight. Of course, there are also daring newspapers, such as the tabloid Paris Morning, which directly published these cases without passing censorship. Early the next morning, thousands of pamphlets containing the dirty deeds of the superior court judges began to circulate throughout Paris. Real cases are far more likely to resonate with readers than any theory or policy analysis, especially the tragic fate of the victims in the case, which made countless Paris citizens angry. The protest skills in the DNA of the French people were instantly activated. Not long after, hundreds of citizens, led by some reporters, spontaneously gathered outside the High Court, shouting curses and protests. The brave ones threw dirt and fesses into the court walls. After another half a day, citizens discovered that the police were only wandering around the perimeter of the High Court and did not pay attention to the protesting crowd, so they joined in one after another, and the number continued to increase. The women formed a logistics team to distribute bread and water to everyone, which attracted homeless people to participate in the protest. There were also more street speeches, and the speakers could even receive written speeches, written by Merit, absolutely full of provocation, which made the audience shout excitedly. At the intersection of Serpent Street, a man wearing a dark grey long coat shook his head and said something to the fat man next to him with a troubled expression. An excited voice came from not far away and attracted the attention of the two people. The so-called justice and morality of those judges are actually just silver coins. Miss Anger's family property was shamelessly awarded to the villain by them, and but he was kicked out of the house in the cold wind and snow. They glanced at the few policemen chatting not far away, and curiously squeezed into the crowd around the speaker. The speech continued, but even so, according to that confusing judgment, she still owed the villain a large amount of money. Do you know her ending? She died of exhaustion in the technical court when she was 23 years old. In the laundry room, covered with frostbite, the man in the grey coat felt a surge of anger in his chest. He pinched the script in his pocket and said to the fat man, "I decided to rehearse this play when I get back." The Fat Man also looked indignant and nodded vigorously. Then it will be at the Comédie France next Wednesday. No, said the man in grey coat. Free street performance. Let more people see it. I will pay for it. He was the director of the theatre company that had collaborated with Paris Business News and performed Breaking the Sky Point when he just went to talk to the newspaper about adapting the drama from the subsequent novel. Danico gave him a script about an Ottoman judge collecting black money, which was actually an allusion to the Paris High Court point. He originally didn't want to take the role as he would be challenged by the censorship department at any time, but the speech he just gave made him decide to be a warrior. What's more, if you star in this drama, you will get a contract with the Paris Merchant to adapt the novel into a drama for the next year thanks to Mr. Late Autumn September for the 10,000 starting point coin reward from Cheyenne Hay Mountain. That is, the author himself. Your generosity makes me feel wonderful and heartwarming support and encouragement. Cheyenne Haitian is very grateful and will definitely work hard to update it today. I will also add more updates for you later. Chapter 86 Meeting. Police Information Department. In the intelligence team office, Fouch had a dark face and a pair of dead fish eyes, staring coldly at the heads of the intelligence team in front of him, and said in a hoarse voice, "Shame. This is simply a shame." The people in the intelligence team lowered their heads in embarrassment, not daring to answer the question at all. Fouch said word by word, "If I give you another 10 days and still can't get anything useful, I will find a few reporters to sit in your seats. Do you understand?" "Yes, I understand." Several people said in unison. They were really helpless. After a lot of effort, their men found some clues about the High Court judge's dirty information and happily asked the informant to show it to Marat. Unexpectedly, Marat smiled and handed the informant a pamphlet. Their big discovery had already been printed on it, and it was much more detailed than what they found. The next day everyone in Paris knew about it. They really couldn't figure out why these reporters could investigate so much faster than their professional intelligence counterparts. A few people could only secretly make up their minds to get important information that shocked these reporters and avenge their previous shame. Fouch left angrily. Several big guys from the intelligence team immediately started whispering to each other. "I'm here with Vezinier's maid and Dubber's mistress. What about you?" "My people got the combination of the safe of Vezinier's house and got 2 people in, but they didn't have the chance to make a move. I copied all the letters from those judges. Do you want to read them?" "My informant can access the High Court's file vault. If that doesn't work, how about we steal all the files?" Paris. Superior Court. In the conference room hall, Justice Vezinier's words were repeatedly interrupted by the voices of protesters outside. He rushed to the window angrily and shouted down, "Can't you be quiet, you uneducated guys?" One of the extremely powerful protesters immediately threw a fist-sized clod of soil over and almost got into the 3rd floor window. Vezinier was startled and quickly retreated to the conference table, shouting with a black face, "What are those police doing? Why haven't they arrested the rioters yet?" A judge with sad eyes sitting on the left covered his ears with his hands and said, "Those pamphlets are the key. They are inciting hatred against the High Court. Without those things, the crowd will disperse soon." Vezinier nodded slowly, but was very puzzled. "Viscount Dubourg, isn't this kind of pamphlet mostly under the control of the person at the Royal Palace? Why did you attack the High Court?" "Who knows?" Dubourg said. "Maybe we have to go and find out the situation from him." The judge next to him with a hooked nose said solemnly, "You go to the Palais Royal. I'll go to the police station. These damn policemen know how to be lazy. I'm almost driven crazy by these untouchables." Soon, several carriages crowded out of the High Court and headed in 2 directions amidst the boos of the protesting crowd. In the study room of the Royal Palace, the Duke of Orleans looked at the 2 middle-aged men in front of him and asked, "So, what do you think?" The judge of the High Court has just left, lamenting that the High Court has been under pressure from public opinion recently, and asked him to find a solution. He also knew that there had been a proliferation of pamphlets out of his control recently, and it was time to take action, so he immediately summoned his 2 most powerful writers to discuss countermeasures. The man with a high nose and a somewhat Italian face flipped through the pamphlet in his hand and said with some hesitation, "Your Majesty, frankly speaking, these novels are very attractive. I mean, ordinary people who have no experience will find it very interesting. The handsome man with blue eyes continued, and it's very cheap. I heard that a copy only costs 1 so 5. You see, it even has 5 illustrations, so. The Duke of Orleans nodded. I need you to write something more interesting as soon as possible to overwhelm these pamphlets. As for the price, you don't have to worry. As a veteran at manipulating public opinion, he knew very well that a 16-page pamphlet with 5 pictures cost 5 to 6 sous. But in order to regain the right to speak in public opinion, he could only sell it for 1 sou and 5 deniers, and judging from the scale of those booklets, it is estimated that at least tens of thousands of copies were sold. In other words, to achieve the same sales volume, he would have to lose 3,000 to 4,000 livres a day. The Duke of Orleans frowned. He could afford the money, but who was the other party's background? He was willing to pay so much money to deal with the High Court. Could it be Brian? He gave a sneer and wanted to use public opinion to challenge me. Then come and try it. Vasinier hurried to the city hall and went straight to the police station, but was told by a clerk that the police chief had gone to Brittany to purchase police equipment. Brittany is far away on the west coast of France, and a round trip takes at least half a month. Vasinier asked helplessly, what about the assistant chief of police? The clerk said respectfully, we are going to Brittany too. Vasinier was angry. Who is in charge here now? The chief of police didn't say. Vasinier was aggrieved, but he had no choice but to return to the carriage and prepare to go to the Louvre District Police Commissioner. However, when he rushed to the Louvre District Police Station, he received the news that Police Commissioner Mr. Arden has taken all the main officials to the Paris Police Academy for training. The next day, Vasinier came to the Paris police station again, only to learn that Arden had gone to the training ground opened by the police academy in the southern suburbs, more than 10 kilometers away. In this way, he and Arden went around in circles for 3 days, but still failed to catch anyone. Eventually, he planned to call in more police to disperse the protesters outside the High Court in the neighboring district of Saint-Germain. The police commissioner of the Saint-Germain district said he wanted to help, but he needed an interregional transfer order from the police chief. Before he could go, Mirabeau watched the scenery outside the carriage window flying backwards. He subconsciously rubbed his cane and frowned unconsciously. To be honest, he really didn't want to participate in today's meeting. He had already received the news about the previous cabinet meeting, and he knew very well that the Crown Prince and Brian were of the same faction, and he had just attended a gathering to denounce Brian a few days ago. What could he have to say to the Crown Prince? But Mr. Dauphin insisted that this meeting was very important and repeatedly asked him to come. Although his relationship with Dauphin was average, Dauphin was the major financial backer behind several politicians he was friends with, and he was also the president of the French Chamber of Commerce. And he runs a large number of workshops and shops himself, and relies on the Chamber of Commerce for a lot of business, so he cannot refute Dauphin's face too much. Son of God. He smiled and shook his head. No matter how talented he was still just a 13-year-old child. Could Brian want to use his identity to negotiate terms with himself? Chapter 87. Who is a friend? The carriage jolted for a long time and finally stopped after entering a large workshop in the town of Saint Antoine. Mirabeau got out of the car and smelled a pungent smell of chemicals. He looked up and saw a row of cooking pots larger than stone mills in the distance, emitting yellow-white mist, and covering half of the workshop. Under the workshed in front is a huge square pool with several wooden sticks hanging on it, and there seemed to be wooden slats intertwined in between. There were more than a dozen workers whose arms were red and swollen from the chemicals. They worked together to move something out of the pool, carefully placed it on a wooden frame that was as tall as one person next to it, and then returned to the pool to start stirring. Mirabeau covered his nose and frowned. What was the Crown Prince thinking? They actually arranged the meeting place in the paper-making workshop. He was complaining in his heart when he saw a middle-aged man with a big nose and wearing a black short coat coming over. He warmly touched his chest and greeted, "Oh, Count Mirabeau, I'm glad to see you here. Although the smell is a bit unpleasant, I believe you will like it in a while." Mirabeau smiled brightly and raised his hat in return. "Nice to see you too, Mr. Dauphin." He took a few steps forward and lowered his voice. "Where's that one, Dauphin?" pulled him around the large pool, and pointed to a wooden frame filled with mist. "Your Highness has been waiting for you for a long time." Only then did Mirabeau see a young man standing on a wooden frame that was as tall as one person. His clothes were clearly different from those around him. He curled his lips, moved his chubby legs, walked over quickly, bowed to the young man and said, "It's an honor to meet you." His Royal Highness the Crown Prince, Dauphin, was busy introducing, "Your Highness, this is Count Mirabeau." Joseph turned to look at Mirabeau, one of the founders of the National Assembly during the French Revolution, an important politician in the current meeting of dignitaries, and a leader of the capital aristocracy. It is also a key point in his fight against the High Court. He jumped down from the wooden frame and raised his hat to Mirabeau. "Oh, great. You are finally here, Count Mirabeau." The surrounding workers were separated by guards in plain clothes, but they did not hear the conversation between the three. Mirabeau asked curiously, "Your Highness, what are you doing here?" "Studying paper-making." Joseph smiled. "Would you like to take a look?" Mirabeau spread his hands. "Oh, you ask me to ride a carriage for most of the day, to come to this remote place. Is it just to study papermaking? Well, this is indeed one of the things we want to talk about. Look, I have no interest in papermaking." Mirabeau smiled and said, "Why don't you tell me directly that you are here on behalf of Archbishop Briand?" "Of course not. He doesn't know that I'm looking for you." Joseph said seriously, "I'm here to make friends with you." Mirabeau nodded hurriedly and said, "Yes, you are my most noble friend." Then he changed the subject. "Of course, the Duke of Orleans and the Duke of Seville are also my friends, so I can't." "No, I think you are mistaken. They are your enemies." "Ah." Mirabeau was stunned, thinking that your wooing tactics were too cheap. He shook his head and said, No, we have a very good relationship." Joseph said calmly, "They are the old aristocrats, and you are the capital aristocrats. You are natural enemies." "What? Capital aristocracy?" Joseph explained to him. "The so-called old nobility are those who own large areas of land and manor, and use food and land rent as their main source of income. The capital aristocrats are like you. Most of their family assets are in industry or trade, and their income depends on making profits." Mirabeau nodded. He seemed to have heard similar theories, "But we are still friends. The focus of your conflict lies in labor force and the demand for the environment." Joseph said, "The old aristocracy needs labor force to farm the land. They hope that there will be manors everywhere, and a few cities for them to enjoy. The capital aristocracy needs labor force to enter workshops or drive merchant ships. They hope that the more cities the better, and just a few manors can produce enough food." Your contradiction is irreconcilable. The old aristocracy is hindering your development, and you want to destroy the paradise of the old aristocracy. Mirabeau was stunned again, and shook his head subconsciously. "No." Joseph smiled and said, "I know that you are now forming an alliance, and want to gain more power." Mirabeau was startled and waved his hands hurriedly. "No, it's not like that." Joseph interrupted him with a smile. "Suppose you bring down the royal family. Of course this is impossible. Assuming that, what do you think will happen next?" "What? A fight to the death between the old and new nobles." "To the death?" Joseph thought to himself. "I have read history. After the great fate, you slaughtered the old nobles until not even the dregs were left." Mirabeau was silent. He carefully deduced in his mind, and found that it was indeed what the crown prince said. Without the king, the two forces would definitely fall into a fight until one party completely lost its strength and power. When Joseph saw that his expression became loose, he began to bring in private goods. The royal family will always need nobles to help them manage the country. From the royal family's perspective, the new and old nobles just develop in different ways. Mirabeau murmured in fear, "I really don't understand what you are talking about." Joseph continued, "Only the royal family can help you remove the obstacles faced by the capital aristocracy." Joseph thought to himself, "Of course you can also rely on bourgeois destiny to eliminate it, but what can I tell you about this? For example, the crown could introduce the Companies Act, including stipulating who is the company's representative. Oh, that is, the person who can exercise company power on behalf of the company, how companies are built, broken up, merged there are also how the company's equity is issued, distributed, and transferred. Scope and liability for corporate debt. Mirabeau's eyes widened when he heard a series of modern company concepts. These were considered common sense in later generations, but in the early days of the Industrial Revolution, they were all extremely valuable advanced experiences. As a representative of the capital aristocracy, Mirabeau attached great importance to the development of industrial industry, and was very aware of the problems France faced in this regard. It can be said that, if there is such a law now, the production efficiency of workshops in France will be greatly improved. Joseph glanced at his expression and continued, there is also the patent law. For example, you design an efficient machine or a very popular fashion, but it is copied by others. Before you make much money, gradually, no one is willing to innovate, but instead try their best to drive down the cost of old industries. And in the end no one can make money. But if there is a patent law, after you apply for a patent for an invention, others can only use it by paying, otherwise they will be heavily fined. Mirabeau's eyes suddenly lit up. This was exactly what he needed. He really wanted to invest money to improve the technology of his workshop, but he had been holding back because he was afraid of giving others an advantage point. If there was a patent law, he could quickly improve his competitiveness, even better than the damn British. Joseph continued to throw bait. By the way, there are also financial law, contract law and so on. After he introduced the meaning of these laws, he looked at Mirabeau and said, do you think the old nobles will support the emergence of these laws? Before Mirabeau could answer, he took the lead and said, no, only with the promotion of the royal family can these laws be quickly formed and help France's industry develop rapidly. Thanks to Gang Menxiali, I'm Biomio Holiday, Loinxio, and Zephyraro for their generous rewards for this book. Cheyenne Haitian is grateful. I love you. Chapter 88 Switching Positions. Seeing that Mirabeau was deep in thought, Joseph knew that the preparation was almost complete, so he started to get to the point. Let's talk about the tax bill again. Mirabeau immediately became alert after hearing this. Your Highness, you know that the nobles have the same attitude towards the bill, Joseph said seriously. Actually, in this matter, you were taken advantage of by the old nobles. Mirabeau smiled and waved his hands. Your Highness, how could this happen? Joseph picked up the small wooden stick next to him to pick out impurities in the pulp and said, I would like to ask, how much real estate do you have? Mirabeau was a little surprised, but still replied, there are more than 10 hectares in Paris and 40 hectares in Reims. Joseph nodded. Then do you know how much real estate the Duke of Orleans has? I'm not sure exactly, but it should be at least 4 to 5,000 hectares. Where's the manor? About a dozen. That's it. The core part of the tax bill is the land tax. Joseph raised the small wooden stick in his hand. For example, this is the size of the land you own, and the land tax will have almost no impact on you. He pointed to the pillars of the paper drying rack in front of them, which were as tall as the two of them, and as thick as a child's waist, and that is the size of the real estate of old nobles like the Duke of Orleans, and the land tax is basically paid by them. This is why they strongly oppose it. Tax bill reasons, but capital aristocrats like you are also coerced by them to fight against the bill together, and they have put in a lot of effort, but they are only protecting their interests. Mirabeau was stunned for a moment. He knew that the crown prince was right, but he immediately retorted, stamp duty. The bill also increased stamp duty, which has a great impact on industry and commerce. The so-called stamp duty is a tax levied when signing a contract or applying for a document. Joseph smiled and said, you are one of the leaders of the distinguished meeting. You must have read the text of the bill. The tax rate of stamp duty is very low. In fact, the main function of stamp duty is to let the government serve as the notary of the contract. When he last revised the bill, he had already lowered the stamp duty rate in order to win over the capital aristocracy. Seeing that Mirabeau was still hesitating, Dauphin couldn't help but said, Count Mirabeau, it is obvious that the tax bill is beneficial to the national finance, and there is no need for us to oppose it, and His Highness also promised that, as long as the bill is passed, he will restart negotiations on the Treaty of Eden and significantly increase tariffs. Dauphin was extremely opposed to the Treaty of Eden. So when Joseph told him that the treaty could be modified, he immediately reached an agreement with the crown prince. Although he had no political power, he could influence Mirabeau and other capital aristocrats, so he facilitated this meeting. Mirabeau immediately looked at Joseph. "Are you sure the British will accept it?" Joseph nodded. "I have already talked with the British ambassador. France's industrial product tariffs have been increased to 25%, while Britain's alcohol tariffs have been reduced to less than 10%. Mirabeau's pupils shrank. "This is impossible. How did you convince the British?" We'll talk about this later, but I can assure you that the new treaty will definitely be signed. Of course, if you are worried, you can learn about the situation from the UK. As a heavyweight political figure, Mirabeau must have his own channels to get news about Britain. Mirabeau finally began to waver. He knows very well that according to the current tariff level, French industry will completely collapse in less than 2 years. By then, those properties of your own will inevitably be in trouble. If you can really use a tax bill that has little impact on you to get the Treaty of Eden re-signed. Oh, and the implementation of the company law and patent law mentioned by the crown prince before, it will definitely be a very cost-effective of. He leaned towards Joseph and said, "Your Highness, this matter will involve many people. I have to go back and discuss it with Viscount Dicot and Viscount Pellier." What? He said were all representatives of the capital aristocracy and the meeting of dignitaries. Based on the conditions mentioned by the crown prince just now, he felt that he was quite confident that he could persuade them to change their stance. "Of course. I look forward to your answer." Joseph smiled and nodded, then raised his hand to gesture to the pulp pool beside him. "Now that the business is over, we can finally talk about paper making." Mirabeau was a little unresponsive. "You mean paper making?" "Yes," said Joseph. "I told you this when you first came here." But Joseph took him to those huge boiling pots and said to the workers guarding the pots, "Please tell Count Mirabeau what is boiling in this pot." The worker immediately lowered his head respectfully and said, "It's wood, sir." "Wood?" Mirabeau looked at Joseph in surprise. "Didn't you just say you wanted to make paper?" Joseph nodded. "This is the first step in making paper. After the wood is boiled, paper can be made. Of course, using my newly created technology." Mirabeau said in disbelief. "You can make paper out of wood?" He still has some knowledge about paper making. Generally speaking, the raw materials used for paper making are rags, flax, etc., with at most some bark fibers mixed in. "Yes, willow and pine." Joseph gestured toward the outside of the workshop. "They were just cut back in the morning." He turned around and asked the worker next to him, "How long has this pot been boiling?" The latter looked at his watch. 6.5 hours, sir. It should be almost done." Joseph was not sure. After all, he had only seen the process of making wood paper on a documentary, so he told the workers, "Please pour out the wood pulp, filter and bleach it." "Oh, just use that's the way it used to be." "Yes, sir." 7 or 8 workers gathered around, lifted the huge cooking pot, and placed it on a wooden stand, opened the lid, and poured the boiling yellow liquid inside into the square stone trough. Mirabeau looked at the liquid in surprise, unable to believe that wood could cook like this. The workers began to use various tools to remove the residue from the wood water. Someone carefully brought a small bottle of chlorine bleach and slowly dripped it into the stone trough while stirring continuously. Then, the workers added a large amount of water to the pulp tank, stirred, filtered, and a series of complicated processes, which took more than half an hour before the pulp cooled down completely. Another group of workers came around with a square sieve, carefully soaked the bottom of the sieve with pulp, and then lifted it up while shaking it gently. When Mirabeau saw the thin layer of mucosa on the bottom of the sieve, he felt his heart beat a few times. If this method can really make paper, it will definitely be a disruptive technology. Compared with previous paper making, raw materials such as rags and flax, wood is almost free, and the cost of paper will drop significantly. This also means that this new paper making technology will unify the European paper market. The young author would like to request a subscription here. Your support is my biggest motivation. The young author is grateful. After the author's health condition improves in the past few days, I will definitely update from time to time to thank you all for your love. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 89, Paper Mill Consensus. The papermaker picked up the fixed paper frame, which is the sieve, and placed it on the shelf. Several stoves were placed around it to increase the temperature point. After more than half an hour, a craftsman took off the fixed paper frame, carefully peeled off the paper on it, and respectfully presented it to Joseph. Sir, you see, it is already dry. In fact, according to the normal drying process, it would take at least half a day. The high temperature drying at this time was purely to show it to Mirabeau. Joseph rubbed the paper in his hand. It was brittle and very thick, and the internal texture was not uniform. It could be said that the quality was quite poor, but this was definitely a piece of paper made of wood. He handed the paper to Mirabeau and said with some regret, "These craftsmen and I are trying new technologies for the first time, so the quality of the finished product is not very good, but he is not in a hurry. The paper-making process relies heavily on experience. The amount of additives to add, the time and temperature for cooking the wood, the use of bleach, drying techniques, etc. must be tried repeatedly to find the best solution to create qualified paper. However, as long as we have the correct technical theory, it is only a matter of time to find a mature process." Mirabeau looked at the paper in his hand excitedly, knowing exactly what this meant. The French paper market alone was worth millions of livres. If exported to the whole of Europe, it would be a market worth at least tens of millions of dollars, and it is foreseeable that the current paper-making technology in any European country is much higher in cost than wood-based paper-making. In other words, there is absolutely no way to stop the dumping of wood and paper. Joseph looked at his excited expression and smiled. "Using my method to make paper, the price can be reduced to 1/7 of the current price of paper. Of course, we don't have to go that low, just sell it at 2/3 of the market price. Keep more profit for yourself." Mirabeau heard the word "we" keenly and looked at the Crown Prince expectantly. Joseph deliberately let him suffer for a few seconds and then said, "As you can see, to roll out this new technology on a large scale requires a considerable amount of money and a lot of energy. I can't do it alone, so I would like to invite you, and of course your friends, to invest together and build a large number of paper-making workshops as quickly as possible to occupy the market. This paper-making technology will be regarded as my equity. This is really great." Mirabeau's eyes were filled with joy. He rubbed the head of his cane and considered. "Then, how many shares do you want to hold?" "Let's say 20%. Paper-making technology is used to win over and divide the meeting of dignitaries, so Joseph will not ask for too many shares." How could Mirabeau not understand that this was the Crown Prince giving away profits, and immediately showed a bright smile. "You are so generous. I think we can make an appointment, and Viscount Decaux, Viscount Palayer, etc. Together let's talk about investing in paper. Oh, and the tax bill." Joseph smiled and nodded. "I very much agree with your proposal." After finalizing the time and place for the meeting, Mirabeau couldn't wait to return to Paris, preparing to meet several of his political allies. After getting on the carriage, he couldn't bear his curiosity, so he turned around and asked, "Your Highness, can you tell me how those wood were boiled into liquid? You need to add some medicine." Joseph smiled and helped him close the car door. Naturally, he wouldn't tell him now that it was actually just adding sulfite. But knowledge is like this. It may be simple to say it, but if no one guides it, it will take half a century before wood-based paper-making technology appears. The next day. Mirabeau brought 3 nobles to Joseph's paper-making workshop. In order to prevent leaks, Joseph had bought this small workshop. "Your Highness, this is Viscount Decaux. This is following Mirabeau's introduction." The 3 of them saluted Joseph in turn. Not long after, another carriage arrived. Archbishop Brian got out of the car in this way. In a dilapidated and crude workshop, the Crown Prince sat on the paper drying rack, The chief minister and Count Mirabeau sat on the cart transporting paper, and several others stood with their backs to the work shed and started a meeting about the future of France. But the negotiation process went very smoothly. Brian promised to work with the crown prince to promote the implementation of the company law, patent law and other bills, then reduce some stamp duty rates. Joseph reiterated that he would restart trade negotiations between Britain and France within 2 months and re-sign the Treaty of Eden in accordance with the tariffs previously mentioned. Mirabeau and others promised that they would persuade their own people in the dignitary meeting to support the tax bill. Since the controlling force behind the High Court is the great nobles of the Council of Lords, this means that their spokespersons in the court will no longer block the tax bill. But what everyone spent the most time on and was most interested in was discussing the establishment of a paper company. The final result of the negotiation was that the 5 people present, except Joseph, invested a total of 3.6 million livres to build a large paper-making workshop in Saint-Antoine, Lyon and Bordeaux, which could meet the paper demand of all France within half a year output. Then, depending on the situation, additional investment will be made to expand production capacity and start exporting until the company can capture the entire European market. Joseph provides technology and holds 20% of the shares, while others share the remaining 80% according to the amount of investment. However, in order to take care of the large number of paper mills in France, Joseph specifically requested that the company must provide pulp to other mills for downstream processing in order to maintain their livelihood. When everything was said and done, everyone was happy. Brian stood up first to say goodbye. Mirabeau and others also left half an hour later. On the street opposite the Paris High Court, a wooden platform 6 or 7 meters square was erected. The wooden platform is surrounded by dark grey curtains. There were 200 to 300 people crowded under the stage, watching the performance on stage attentively. When the villain, who played the Ottoman judge, accidentally ate poisoned cakes out of greed and died wailing, the audience burst into thunderous cheers. Someone turned and pointed to the High Court in the distance and shouted, "Did you see it? This is the end of a shameless corrupt official. You should do the same. You rats and maggots, do you dare to come out?" In the conference hall on the 3rd floor of the High Court, several judges heard the music of the drama stop. They all breathed a sigh of relief and turned their attention back to the conference table. With a disdainful expression, Vezinier threw the pile of documents in front of him forward and snorted, "There is nothing to review. No matter how Brian changes it, it is impossible for this thing to be registered." What he threw out was the new tax bill that Brian had just submitted this morning. Dubois looked at the judge next to him, who had a sharp chin and a surprised expression at the corner of his eyes. He slowly opened his copy of the bill and said calmly, "I think we should discuss it. Maybe there will be something different." "What's the conclusion?" "Thanks to book friend 20230707210738733 for generously tipping this book. Cheyenne Haitian is grateful." Chapter 90 Stumbling Block. "What do you want to discuss?" Vezinier turned his head and looked at Dubois in surprise. "There is no need to even criticize this bill. The conclusion can only be that it will not be registered." Dubois gestured towards the dense crowd of protesters outside the window. "Mr. Dean, please listen to their voices. Maybe we should make some changes in this matter." The judge, sitting opposite him, with dark circles covering half of his face, rubbed his bloodshot eyes, yawned and nodded. "I see. This matter must be settled. If we make some adjustments to the provisions of the bill, it's not non-negotiable." He almost didn't sleep all night last night because every once in a while, someone threw stones at his villa and several pieces of glass were broken. The women and children and the family were so scared that they cried and cried all night. On his way to the High Court this morning, citizens were standing on the rooftops on both sides of the street, cursing and throwing tiles at his carriage. The driver's hands were injured. Now he no longer wants to care about whether the law is passed or not. He just hopes that these troublemakers will disperse as soon as possible so that his home can be peaceful. So after Dubois started, he immediately had the intention to second the proposal. The other short judge also nodded slightly subconsciously. The judge with a hooked nose beside Vezinier frowned and said, "Do you want us to listen to those intouchables outside and then make it difficult for all decent people?" If This bill is beneficial, then decent people should not be in trouble. The judge, who always had a surprised expression in his eyes, said and gave Dubois a look. The latter put together the text of the bill in front of him and looked around at the crowd. If you don't want to discuss the terms of the bill, then let's just vote. Versaillais. I swept across the faces of the two men and said coldly, do you know what you are talking about? Rejecting this bill is the consensus of all nobles. There is no need to vote. It's not a consensus. Dubois shook his head. Let's ask the dignitaries sitting here to vote. The so-called key members are the core judges of the internal deliberative body of the High Court. There are currently 6 people with great authority and can hold meetings to decide most court affairs, as Dubois said. He raised his hand first. I think the tax bill can be registered. The judge, who always looked surprised, raised his hand. I agree too. The judge with dark circles hesitated for a moment, remembering that the High Court had almost become a symbol of sin and corruption, and the day before yesterday when even the skilled women refused to serve him. He slowly raised his hand. 3 key members rebelled, causing the atmosphere in the conference hall to suddenly change. The short judge was also made miserable by the protesters. He glanced around and was about to raise his hand when he saw Versailles suddenly stood up and shouted loudly, I will never allow this bill to be registered. He raised his hand and pointed at the black eye Count Valdier, who supports you to become the Chancellor. Are you going to betray them? He looked at the shortest judge again. Viscount Aurel, I have to remind you of Duke Aiguilon's attitude towards the bill. As the president of the High Court, Versailles was quite powerful. His words frightened Judge Aurel to the point where he trembled and retracted his hand in a hurry. Judge Wadi was struggling, moving his right hand back and forth several times, not knowing what to do. Dubois also stood up and said dissatisfied, I protest. Count Versailles, you are threatening the freedom to vote. Versailles finally waited until Valdièr's raised hand was put back on the table. He ignored Dubois and waved his hand with a dark face. That's it for today. Let's break up the meeting. Palais Royal. The Duke of Orleans frowned at the brochure sample in his hand, shook his head and said, Vicomte Laclas, this is too little. You must give me at least 3,000 words of manuscript to promote sales. Laclas, standing in front of him, said with a grimace, Your Majesty the Duke, I really can't do anything. I wrote this after I didn't sleep all night. He looked at the man beside him who looked a bit like an Italian. Mr. Brisset didn't even submit the manuscript. The Duke of Orleans grabbed a thick pamphlet next to him and said angrily, but the novel they have here has more than 7,000 words. If this continues, who'll buy ours? Laclas and Brisset were also extremely depressed. They are both outstanding contemporary novelists. The former, in particular, once became famous all over Paris with his book Dangerous Liaisons, which attracted countless French writers to add danger or relationship to their titles to gain popularity. This time he also prepared a wonderful novel for the pamphlet of the Duke of Orleans, but his writing speed soon couldn't keep up. According to the previous pace, he could write 3,000 words of plot in a week, which was the limit. And now the Duke of Orleans wants him to complete this amount in 3 days, which is impossible. He really couldn't figure out why the guy with the pen named Silkworm and Potato and Octopus in the Water could easily write more than 7,000 words every 3 days. Don't they even have to think about it? For the first time in these days, Laclas had doubts about his writing talent. As for Brisset, he has simply given up struggling and is ready to change careers. The Duke of Orleans knew that he had lost control of public opinion, as evidenced by the growing number of protesters outside the High Court. But he was unable to fight back at all. When he was upset, the butler knocked on the door and reported, Sir, Mr. Alexis is here, and said he has something important to do. The Duke of Orleans was a little surprised. Alexis was a confidant of Justice Versailles. What could happen to the High Court? When he listened to Alex's words in the study room, he was suddenly shocked. Someone voted to approve the tax bill and get registered. This is crazy. The High Court, which was originally regarded as the strongest bulwark against the royal power, actually had cracks. He hurriedly ordered the steward to invite the members of the Council of Dignitaries to come to the royal palace for a gathering. Palace of Versailles. Joseph opened the unsigned letter and read it carefully. The content of the letter is very short, roughly describing the process of today's High Court vote on the tax bill. Although it was almost passed, it was eventually suppressed by Vezinier with the power of the president of the court. At the end of the letter, they said they would continue to think of a solution. Joseph frowned, but he didn't expect that when he gained the momentum, the aristocratic group would lose face and rely on the position of a dean to hold back the bill. It's just that the dean election will have to wait until 2 years later. And I don't have that much time. He tapped his fingers on the table and thought quickly in his mind. Therefore, in the current situation, the stumbling block of Vezinier must be removed. Thanks to Mr. Zanliu Jiang, Mr. Zimu, and Mr. Book Friends 2023070721073873 for their generous rewards for this book. Cheyenne Haitian is so grateful. Chapter 91. Unable to prove. Joseph calculated the time and found that there was only 1 month left before the tax bill was passed and the deadline for registration was passed. To overthrow the president of the High Court in such a short period of time, we can only use some unconventional means. When he mentioned unconventional means, he immediately thought of the police intelligence department, so he signaled to Eamon, "Please send someone to ask for Fouch." He suddenly remembered that he had to go to the police academy to attend the tactical command class today. "No, prepare a car. I will go there myself." 3 carriages drove out of the Palace of Versailles and entered Paris a few hours later. As soon as the car passed the Seine River, Joseph saw from a distance a large wooden sign more than 2 people high on the east side of the bridge with a huge oil painting on it. In the painting, a graceful lady in full dress is holding a small glass bottle, sitting in a warm and elegant home, with a happy and satisfied expression on her face. At the top of the painting is a row of huge words. "No gifts for Christmas this year, only ladies." There is also a row of small words below. Giffaril Health Solutions big Christmas offer, a free exquisite gift box. The car walked a little further, and there were 2 young people on the side of the road, dressed in fancy clothes, waving flowers and shouting loudly, "Buy Paris Angel Cosmetics, and you will receive a 20% discount coupon for Giffaril Healthcare Liquid when you spend 50 livres or more." Joseph nodded secretly in his mind. Manager Brent was indeed worthy of his salary. Although the marketing idea was given to him by himself, as a person from the 18th century, he was definitely a business genius for being able to understand it so thoroughly and put it into practice. You can consider giving him more bonuses. Not long after, the carriage drove into the police information office. Joseph went straight into the office and said to Fouche, "What can we use to arrest Vezinier?" The intelligence chief obviously knew it by heart and said without thinking, in his first year as a judge in Paris, he took bribes and awarded the inheritance of the Antoine brothers to their uncle. The following year, in a case where a nobleman's carriage hit a person, the person who was hit was found to have intentionally frightened the horse and was only compensated 50 livres. It should have been paid. In the same year, in the Camille home invasion murder case, the evidence against the murderer disappeared from the court evidence room, and the murderer was acquitted. It is said that the murderer's uncle gave the judge 8,000 livres. 2 years later, the Saddle Street murder case, the murderer's nobleman bribed. He spoke for a long time, and Joseph frowned. Since he became a judge, this Vezinier has almost been accepting bribes and creating unjust cases, and has never stopped. Joseph interrupted Fouche. "So, I can send someone to arrest him now?" This Fouche shook his head. "I'm afraid not." "Why? What he did is enough to hang him 10 times. Fouche said awkwardly, "These cases have at best some scattered records, or simply what Mr. Merritt told me. No conclusive evidence has been found yet." Joseph couldn't help frowning when he heard this, but he was relieved immediately. Vezinier himself was a lawyer and would definitely pay great attention to destroying evidence. He extended his hand to Fouche and said, "Bring me this guy's information and see if there is anything I can use." "Yes, Your Highness." Soon, a stack of documents nearly half a meter thick was placed on the table in front of Joseph. It was obvious that the police intelligence department had been working very hard recently. Joseph picked up the top document and opened it. The basic information about Vezinier was recorded in it. Henry François Mindy Vezinier, 56 years old, 5 feet tall, weight. At the age of 33, he inherited the position of his father, who was a judge in Grenoble and was elected as a local judge. Today's judges are so miraculous that they can perfectly combine the hereditary system with the electoral system and elect the positions inherited from their fathers. 6 years later, he was transferred to the Paris High Court. At the age of 51, he passed the election and became the president of the High Court. Personal property interest favorite. Food, frequently visited places, almost everything is listed in detail. It can be said that it is impossible for Vezinia's parents and wife to understand him so well. Joseph picked up the next document. This one was the social relations of the president of the court, political allies, Duke Aiguillon, Count Serurier, political opponents, close friend, Dacier, judge of the Paris High Court, 49 years old, Verrier, assistant to the municipal commissioner of Keene, 51 years old, normal, friend enemy. The following documents are about the situation of Vezinia's home, including the layout of his house, details of the coachman, gardener, cook, maid, etc. What surprised Joseph the most was that there was a special note on this document. Vezinia's 2 living room maids had been taken care of by the young men sent by Fouche. Now these 2 girls simply obey their handsome, romantic, and wealthy boyfriends. One could even find out from them how many times Vezinia yawned every day. Joseph held his forehead and smiled bitterly. Fouche was simply a little crazy. In order to get some information, he would not hesitate to go to the little girl from Huohuo. He put down the documents in his hand and picked up a large pile of letter paper and found that these were all Vezinia's personal letters in recent years. Fouche took the credit and said, "Your Highness, half of these were provided by the Black Room and the rest were copied directly in Vezinia's study." The Black Room he was talking about was the postal spy of the secret police, who was responsible for checking all kinds of letters. It was the most efficient department of the secret police. However, the Black Room is still no match for Fouche's maid tactics. They must have obtained the letters in the study. Joseph asked, "Is there any usable evidence in these letters?" Fouche shook his head. Everything that could be used to prove him should have been destroyed. Joseph had no choice but to open the last document, which was also the one with the most content, recording information on all the cases handled by Vezinia. Fouche added, "Your Highness, these are taken directly from the High Court archives and are absolutely reliable." Joseph nodded and started flipping through. The first one is a property division case, and the trial is coming to an end. The second case was a case of rape and murder, and the trial only started more than 10 days ago. The case is probably that a young nobleman named Runash suddenly became lustful and kidnapped a 15-year-old civilian girl into his oil painting shop and raped her during this period. The girl's 9-year-old brother followed the traces and came to the door and shouted for help. In desperation, Runash dragged the boy into the house and killed him. Later, he was worried that the matter would be exposed, so he killed the girl and threw her body into the Seine River. Because several belongings of the deceased were found in Runach's shop and a neighbor saw the boy entering the oil painting shop, Runach was quickly arrested and prosecuted. Joseph couldn't help but sigh, feeling sorry for the 2 siblings. According to case file records, the case has been tried once, but a verdict has not yet been pronounced. Thanks to book friend 201903081320242384 for generously tipping this book. Cheyenne Haitian is grateful. Chapter 92. My cousin is here. Joseph read the case handled by Vezinia from beginning to end and discussed it with Fouche and others for a long time, but found that there was really no place to start. If you investigate some cases carefully, you may be able to dig out some clues, but it will definitely take a long time. When everyone was at a loss what to do, Emin came over and reminded in a low voice, "Your Highness, if you don't set off, you will not be able to catch up with the classes at the police academy." Joseph rubbed his temples. It seemed that he couldn't find a handle on Vezinia for a while, so he might as well go to the command department first. He got up and walked outside the house. After thinking about it, he turned around and called Fouche to prepare for more research on the way. Fouche hurriedly picked up a large pile of information about Vezinia on the table and quickly followed him. However, before taking a few steps, the letters and the information suddenly fell out with a crash. Fausch put down the document awkwardly and called on everyone around him to come over and help pick up the letter. Joseph looked at the hundreds of letters on the ground and waved. "Let's go. There's no need to pick it up. There's no useful evidence anyway." He breathed a sigh of relief and shook his head irritably. It would be nice if there were a few letters containing evidence of his guilt. At this point, he stopped suddenly, feeling as if he had caught some inspiration. Since I have no incriminating evidence in my hand, can I try to get Vezinier to take the initiative to write some evidence? He quickly ran through the information he had just read in his mind, suddenly turned around, pulled out a few documents from the documents next to Fausch, and spread them out on the table. One of them was Vera's information. And then he looked at the information about the father of Runash, the murderer of the recent murder. Although the two have nothing to do with each other, they have one thing in common. They are both keen people. Joseph lowered his head and thought, maybe he could use this little grip to push forward like this, and then induce like this. Then, no matter how careful Vezinier is, he will inevitably fall into a pit. He grabbed the information of Vezinier's maid and read it again, and asked Fausch excitedly, "Is there anyone in the police intelligence department who is good at imitating other people's handwriting?" Fausch nodded. "There are several of them, Your Highness." "Okay, call them over quickly." Joseph pointed to the letter on the ground again. "Look for Vera's letter." "Ah, Verrier?" Fausch reacted, remembering that he was a close friend of Vezinier, and crouched down and started searching. After a moment, he held up a letter. "Your Highness, here it is." Several professionals who could imitate handwriting came to the office one after another. Under Joseph's command, they imitated the handwriting of Vezinier and Verrier, and wrote several paragraphs with reference to their letters. Joseph selected the two people who imitated the most, and then asked people to find all Vera's letters and hand them over to professional intelligence personnel to analyze whether there were any secret codes or anything like that. After the preparations were completed, Joseph said to Fausch, "Select a few capable men and go to Keene immediately." Keene. Joseph nodded. "Go and investigate the situation of Verrier in detail, and then arrange it like this." After he finished explaining, Fausch obviously thought of something from this. His eyes suddenly lit up, and he nodded repeatedly. "Yes, I will do it now." Joseph then made detailed plans with Fausch, and confirmed that all the details had been taken into consideration. Then he left the police intelligence office with ease and headed towards the police academy. Just judging by the time, the tactical command class must have ended long ago. A few days later, on the left bank of Paris, in a small villa on Rue Mauforte. Two aristocratic couples in their 40s sat on chairs with sad faces, each lowering his head and thinking about his own thoughts, and sighed from time to time. On the table in front of them lay stew, bread, and vegetable corn soup, but the food was already cold, but not a bite was touched at all. A knock on the door woke them both. The maid hurriedly opened the door a crack and said, "Who are you looking for? Is this the home of Viscount Monterey?" "I am here." The man in the room stood up tiredly, walked towards him, and frowned at the strange man in front of him. "Excuse me, who are you?" "Sylvain, it's me." The visitor enthusiastically hugged Viscount Monterey's shoulders and patted him. Seeing that the latter was still dazed, he pointed to himself with a smile and said, "Langer, have you forgotten your expression, younger brother, cousin?" Viscount Monterey was confused. Mr. Lange seemed a little unhappy. He put the gift he was carrying into Monterey's hands, took a step back and said, "My mother is your Aunt Angelique. Do you remember it?" Monterey suddenly understood and nodded repeatedly. "Is Aunt Angelique okay?" "Oh, dear cousin, how did you find me here?" The so-called Lange is naturally not his cousin, but an agent of the police intelligence department. The police intelligence office had previously visited Keene, Monterey's hometown, and made full preparations, specifically choosing a distant relative of his as the entry point. Lange took out a week-old Keene news from his pocket and opened it for Monterey to read. "I saw the news about Runacher's nephew. Oh, it's such a pity." What was published in the newspaper was the news about the Runacher murder case that Vezinier had recently taken over. Mrs. Monterey also came over, covering her face with red eyes, and said, "God, even Keene knows about this." "Langer, said hurriedly. My mother also saw the news and immediately said that I must help you. So I rushed here. Oh, by the way, how is the case now? Has the verdict been announced, Viscount? Monterey shook his head. Not yet. But the presiding judge doesn't want to see me. In my opinion, there may be no hope. Lange smiled, patted him and said, that's why I came here. Do you have any idea? Lange nodded. The master rhyme serving now has some friendship with the judge, and I will help you with it. Of course, it may cost a sum of money, a large sum of money. The Monterey couple was so excited that they almost knelt down in front of him and kept saying, we will find a solution regarding the money issue. As long as we don't sentence you to hanging, anything else is fine. Please. Lange pulled them to sit down on the chairs and asked, please tell me about the case in more detail. After a long time, the Viscount of Monterey finally narrated the case in detail. Lange asked some more details, then stood up immediately and said, okay, I'll go to the High Court right away. Just wait for my good news. 40 minutes later, Lange's carriage stopped outside the side entrance of the Paris High Court. He glanced at the dark mass of protesters in front of him, shook his head helplessly, pushed through the crowd, and squeezed in. Not long after, in the largest office on the third floor of the High Court, he finally met the target of the operation. Justice Vezinier. The new book is on the shelves, begging for full subscription. Monthly tickets, reviews, everything. The young author is grateful. As a preview, there will be an update today, so stay tuned. Chapter 93. Dig a hole, dig it bigger. Lange bowed to Vezinier in a very reserved manner, introduced his identity, and then handed a letter to the justice. Vezinier confirmed that the paint on the envelope was intact, then slowly opened it, and at the same time, asked about the situation in very like a casual conversation. The police intelligence division has already figured out these things clearly, so Lange naturally answered them fluently. Vezinier then took out his glasses and began to read the letter. In the letter, Verrier first recalled some of the previous events between the two, and then mentioned that Lange, who brought this letter, was his most loyal manservant, and could completely trust him. Vezinier had not seen Verrier for 3 or 4 years, and he vaguely remembered that there was a manservant named Lange beside his good friend. He continued to look down. Verrier stated in the letter that one of his cousins, the Viscount Monterey, was involved in a lawsuit. I recently read the newspaper and found out that the judge presiding over this case was my old friend, so I wanted to ask my old friend for help. It's just that I haven't been feeling well lately, so I asked my valet to come to Paris to handle the lawsuit, and then I'll come to visit my old friend as soon as the weather gets warmer. Then he said that he hoped that Vezinier could try to give Runache a lighter sentence. As for the cost of management, the Monterey family has already prepared it, and they will definitely not embarrass their old friends. Yes. On the Vezinier side, Monterey's relative became Verrier again. Vezinier put away the letter, looked at Lange and said, of course I will help Victor. But that young man went too far, and if there are witnesses, he will be sentenced to at least whipping, and more than 30 years in prison. Lange nodded, rubbed his hands nervously and said, my lord Count, actually, my master means that it is best to be found not guilty. Vezinier was about to shake his head, but Lange's next words made his eyelids twitch. The Vicomte de Monterey is willing to pay 35,000 livres. After a moment of silence, Vezinier sighed and said, it's not easy to deal with the witness. We'll figure it out. Vezinier suddenly turned around, waved his hand and said, go back first. I will give you an answer in a few days. That afternoon, when Vezinier returned home, he immediately wrote a letter and sealed it with wax. Then he summoned his confidant Bruno and asked him to send it to Keene as quickly as possible and give the letter to Verrier. Viscount. Before Bruno got on the carriage, the glassmaker at Vezinier's house passed the news to the police intelligence officers who had been guarding outside the villa. Vezinier's confidants drove non-stop for 2 days and finally arrived in Keene. This small city has only one major road leading to Paris. At this time, the vendors on both sides of the road were shrinking their necks and listlessly soliciting business. Bruno looked at the map, got out of the car, and walked to the nearest hawker, asking whether Viscount Vallier's home was. Verrier is the deputy mayor of Keene, and everyone knows him. After the hawker got 5 deniers, he enthusiastically pointed out the way for him. Bruno got on the road again, and when he got near the city center, he got out of the car again and stopped a young man to ask for directions. The young man was about to answer when he saw someone fighting not far away and approaching quickly. He was so frightened that he immediately turned around and left. Bruno looked around, grabbed the middle-aged man who happened to be passing by, and asked about the location of Viscount Verrier's house, and then got the same answer as the hawker. It was already dusk when Bruno arrived at the Verrier family villa. Valet enthusiastically let him into the room. The latter looked at the very family emblem on the wall and the stair railing, and nodded secretly in his mind. Then he saw the sick Viscount Verrier wrapped up tightly, nodding to him on the second floor. Bruno hurriedly handed the master's letter to the footman, who then went upstairs and handed it to Verrier. About half an hour later, Bruno received a reply from Viscount Verrier and immediately rushed back to Paris overnight. It's just that he didn't notice that the gardeners, handymen and others in the villa looked exactly like the vendors doing business on the road into Keene. The maid who served him tea was one of the group of people fighting in the city center, but she changed into women's clothes. The police intelligence department was really short of female spies, so they had to make a cameo. As for the Verrier who greeted him, under the dim lights, and so far away, if he could just find someone to put on makeup, even if Verrier's biological mother was here, there was a high probability that he wouldn't be able to tell the difference. The real location of Verrier's house is actually a few kilometers away. When Bruno returned to Paris, he gave the reply to Vezinier and said that he had met Viscount Verrier and had tea at his house. This cannot be blamed on his incompetence. In this era of extremely underdeveloped information, it is indeed difficult to identify the authenticity of someone in a distant city in a short period of time. Even if he goes directly to the city hall, the police intelligence department has already deployed manpower there, allowing him to see Viscount Verrier from a distance. By this time, Vezinier no longer had any doubts and immediately summoned Langert and told him that he could try to exonerate Runache, but because the case was too big, 40,000 livres were needed. Lange immediately agreed, but hoped that the trial could be held as soon as possible, because the young nephew of Viscount Verrier, Runache, had lived a good life since he was a child and could not stand the torture in prison. Naturally, Vezinier agreed wholeheartedly. Lange returned to the Viscount of Monterey's house and told them the news. He went to see a doctor on the pretext that the witness in the Runache case often drank alcohol and beat his wife. He paid the doctor to issue a certificate stating that the witness had mental problems. In Monterey, they mortgaged their family villa and oil painting shop and scraped together things here and there. In the end, they only came up with more than 30,000 livres. Lange had no choice but to pay them 6,500 livres from his own pocket. When everything was ready, Lange repeatedly told his cousin that they were family members of the criminal and could not have more contact with the judge, and then he took them outside the Vezinier's villa. The Viscount of Monterey handed the banknotes to Judge Vezinier's servant and saw the justice nodding to him from the window, and a huge stone in his heart finally fell to the ground. Lange came to Vezinier's house that night, solemnly thanked him on behalf of his master, and asked him to write a reply to his master to prove that he had completed the task well. Vezinier had just earned 40,000 livres and was in a good mood. He wrote 3 pages on the spot, mainly to express to his old friend how much he had contributed to this matter and to let him remember this favor. By the way, he also complimented the manservant. Lange then left with the letter. A few days later, a messenger from Verrier sent a letter of thanks from the master to Vezinier. The justice opened the letter, read it once, and immediately burned it. He also told the messenger to go back and tell Verrier to burn the latest correspondence. He has handled too many unjust, false and wrong cases and knows the importance of destroying evidence. 5 more days later, the Runache case resumed. First, the witness was proven to have mental problems and his testimony was invalid. Then it was discovered that the so-called relics found in Runache's house did not belong to the deceased. This was naturally caused by Vezinier's manipulation in the evidence room. The new book is on the shelves, begging for full subscription, monthly tickets, reviews, everything. The young author is grateful. Chapter 94 Public Trial. In the court, the young lawyer defending the victim smiled and listened to the judge confusing right and wrong, but remained silent. Soon, accompanied by the mourning of the parents of the murdered siblings, Vezinier raised his gavel and pronounced the verdict. This court declares that Runash is not guilty of rape and murder and is acquitted. Just when the gavel in his hand was about to fall, the young lawyer suddenly stood up and shouted, "This is an illegal verdict. You are trampling on the law." Vezinier shook his head. He had seen many such noisy young people. He smiled contemptuously and waved to the bailiff. "Drive this guy out. By the way, what is his name? He will then be charged with insulting the court." The lawyer said without flinching, "My name is Danton. George Jack Stanton. You can sue me." He raised a few more pieces of paper above his head. "But Mr. Judge, you have to explain first what these letters are about." "Letter? What letter?" Vezinier looked at those pages and felt that they seemed familiar. Suddenly his expression changed. It seemed to be a letter he had written to Verrier. Why did it fall into the hands of this lawyer? The letter was naturally given to the lawyer by the police intelligence department. Not long ago, Joseph accidentally heard Fouch mention that the lawyer of the victim in the Runacher case was named Danton, so he immediately asked someone to check the registered lawyers of the High Court and learned that there was only one named Jack Stanton among them. In other words, this young lawyer was the later Jacobin leader historically. Danton hated evil and had a very high level of speech and could easily incite thousands of people to riot. So Joseph immediately decided to leave the finishing work of dealing with Vezinier to him. When encountering a case of this extremely egregious nature, Danton would definitely be able to make a big splash. At the trial site, Danton jumped onto the chair in the auditorium and read out loud the part of Vezinier's letter that could be used as evidence. "My dear old friend, I saw your manservant. But I still I need to confirm, do you really want me to intervene in Runash's case? As for the money, it has to be used for up and down management. You know, just for the evidence room, you have to give them 10,000 livres. After all, destroying evidence is a very serious crime. I don't know what they're going to do with that witness, but I swear to you, I can acquit your nephew, as long as that damn carpenter doesn't open his mouth." Poor Runash must have had enough of the moldy and cold prison. Oh, originally he was going to stay there until death, or even the gallows. But don't worry, I will let him out after the next court session. Bailiff, stop him. Vezinier pointed at Danton and shouted like crazy, "He is lying." Before several bailiffs in the court could react, Vezinier had already impatiently stepped on his chair, jumped out from behind the trial table, and rushed towards Danton with red eyes. The latter, however, nimbly ran and dodged among the tables and chairs in the courtroom, while continuing to read the letter. By the time he finished reading the key points, he had already run to the door of the court, pushed aside the bailiff who was guarding there, and rushed out of the door. Thousands of citizens had already gathered outside the High Court, many more than usual to protest. They were all just summoned by Marat, Desmoulins and others to cooperate with the trial. Danton rushed to the iron fence of the court and shouted, "That shameless and despicable guy just now humiliated the law in front of everyone. He actually acquitted the murderer." The crowd immediately burst into angry roars. "Hang the murderer, hang that corrupt judge too, hanging must be hanged." Danton signaled everyone to be quiet and raised the letter in his hand. "I have obtained the evidence that the judge is corrupt, and I will definitely make him receive the punishment he deserves." Several bailiffs wanted to stop Danton, but under the intimidation of thousands of people, they were afraid to step forward. In fact, more than 30 police officers were on standby just over 10 steps away. If the bailiffs dared to take action, they would immediately rush in and save Danton. Danton continued to shout, "In order to prevent those people from destroying the evidence, I suggest that we hold a public trial here." The crowd suddenly shouted again, "Public trial, right. Here, let's watch the trial. Get out of here, the judge who let the murderer go." In this way, the angry people roared for a whole day, and more people gathered. It was not until dusk that Chief Minister Brian appeared and promised in public that the Vezinier bribery case would be heard publicly in the square in front of the High Court by the Royal Court of Plenipotentiary, and people gradually dispersed. At 11 o'clock in the evening, Vezinier asked his men to confirm repeatedly that there were no protesters outside the court. Then he put on a coachman's clothes and sneaked out from the back door. However, what he didn't know was that the people from the police intelligence department had been watching him in the dark. Vezinier's carriage had just passed the streets when someone shouted, "The judge who collaborated with the murderer is here. Everyone, come quickly, Vezinier is here." Torches were quickly lit around him, and Merritt rushed up with hundreds of people, pulled Vezinier out of the car, and beat him severely without any explanation. In the corner, dozens of police officers felt that they were done, and they showed up with whistles to separate the crowd. After all, they couldn't really beat the criminal to death. Otherwise there would be no subject for trial. On the ground, Vezinier had been beaten to the point of losing his human form, lying in a pool of blood, and twitching. 2 days later, a judge was dispatched by the Royal Court of Plenipotentiary to hear the Vezinier case in public at the entrance of the High Court. The Royal Court of Plenipotentiary was under the control of the king, and was still very authoritative in the era before Louis XIV. Later, the authority was gradually transferred to the High Court, and now it has become a ceremonial institution. Several judges never dreamed that they would one day actually hear a case. However, with thousands of angry citizens watching, no one dared to question whether they were qualified to hear the case. Vezinier, who had one of his legs broken, was lying on the side covered with bandages, moaning in pain from time to time. Danton handed the letters to the judge, claiming that they still existed at Vezinier's house. The judge immediately ordered a search of Vezinier's home, and soon a letter from Verrières was found in his study. The letters exchanged between the two parties corroborated each other, and further confirmed the fact that Vezinier accepted bribes to exonerate Runiter. Lying on the wooden board, Vezinier couldn't figure out why these letters appeared in his home after he had obviously burned them. In fact, Verrières wrote 2 copies of her letters, one for Vezinier to burn, and the other for her maid to put quietly into his study. Subsequently, the Monterey family was also called to testify. Under the evidence and the glare of countless people, the couple quickly admitted to bribing the judge. The Royal Court of Plenipotentiary also announced in public that Vezinier was found guilty of bribery, cover-up, and destruction of evidence, and sentenced to 50 years in prison. And because of Vezinier's bad character, the court announced that all the cases it had previously heard would be remanded for a new trial. Thousands of citizens who were watching suddenly burst into thunderous cheers. Only Danton, Merritt and others were not in high spirits. They wanted only one verdict, and that was hanging. I have launched a poll on the fate of Robespierre in the book circle, and I ask all readers to cast your precious vote. Chapter 95, adding insult to injury. Several judges of the plenipotentiary court immediately stepped aside, and the High Court judge, Count Vadier, stepped forward, cautiously read the verdict just now, signed his name, and sealed it. Because the plenipotentiary court does not have the power to judge, Vadier still has to go through the legal process. At this point, Vezinier was truly convicted. Someone in the crowd of onlookers immediately made a dissatisfied protest. The power to judge. The all-powerful court must have the power to judge. We cannot let those shameless judges judge ourselves. High Court guys just cover for each other. Yes, they have no qualifications. Let them be tried by a full court. After a few people took the lead, it soon turned into thousands of people shouting, and the word judgment resounded in the sky. In fact, it was Joseph's arrangement to have the Royal Plenipotentiary Court come forward, and the people who took the lead in calling for trial power today had also been prepared for it. Joseph spent a lot of effort this time and finally opened a hole in the High Court. Naturally, he wanted to add insult to injury. No, he wanted to pursue the victory and completely tear this monster raised by the aristocratic group into pieces. It was not until Vezinier was carried away, and the judge of the plenipotentiary court promised to everyone that he would convey the matter of judicial power to His Majesty the King, that the citizens gradually became quiet. That afternoon, the entire High Court was enveloped in an atmosphere of gloom and loss. But everyone was very busy. Because there are so many cases that Vezinier has presided over, the workload of all retrials is huge. At present, almost all the energy of the entire court is devoted to this matter in the conference room on the 3rd floor. 5 judges serving as key members were voting on the new tax bill. I support registration. Debo raised his hand first. Vadia raised his hand even faster than Judge Gretel of the Dubois line. I agree too. The shocking scars on Vezinier's body still lingered in his mind. Now he just hopes that all this will end as soon as possible and that he can return to his former peace. This time without Vezinier's repression. All 4 judges quickly agreed to register the bill. Only Luo, from the old aristocracy, abstained from voting with a dark face. A ray of sunlight streamed in from the window of the conference hall and fell on the text of the bill on the table. Dubois looked around at the judges, then opened the document, blocked the sun with his left hand, and wrote approved to register with a pen in his right hand, and then stamped it with the seal of the Paris High Court. The tax bill, which had been delayed for a year and rejected several times, leading to the removal of a finance minister and used by the aristocratic group as a tool to suppress the royal family, was finally passed at this moment, after Joseph's careful planning. The situation of expansion of aristocratic power and retreat of royal power was completely reversed. Palace of Versailles. In the comfortable and elegant concert hall, Queen Mary heard that the tax bill that had tortured her for nearly a year was finally passed. She was so excited that she almost danced on the spot and immediately praised Brian. Don't hesitate to express your praises. Subsequently, the judges of the plenipotentiary tribunal reported to her the protesters' request to be granted jurisdiction. How could the queen, who had been disgusted by the high court for so long, miss this good opportunity to vent her anger? She immediately signed the edict without hesitation, granting the plenipotentiary court the power to hear all cases involving Vezinier. Although the nobles who learned about this wanted to object very much, no one dared to show it. Now, things were abuzz with Vezinier. Anyone who says no at this time will definitely be regarded as an accomplice of the corrupt judge, waiting to be reviled by old Parisians. The control of public opinion is not in their hands now, and it is simply impossible to confuse them. However, the queen is also very worried about the situation, where thousands of protesters have been rioting in the high court for more than a month. It is impossible for any ruler not to feel nervous about large-scale street demonstrations, so she ordered Brian to disperse the protesters as soon as possible and restore peace to Paris. After Joseph learned about the promulgation of Vezinier's edict, he suddenly felt relieved, which would make subsequent operations much easier. He originally thought that given the queen's nagging and undecided character, he might have to persuade Brianna himself, but he didn't expect that she would act so neatly this time. Perhaps it was because the tax bill was passed that she subconsciously felt more confident. Next, as long as the judges of the plenipotentiary court exert more force, the high court should collapse. In the crown prince's drawing room, 3 judges of the plenipotentiary court sat respectfully on the sofa, all looking attentive and listening. They learned from the few words revealed by Archbishop Brian that the reason why they were able to show up in the high court was because of the opportunity given by His Royal Highness the Crown Prince. Joseph looked at the 3 of them with a smile and asked, I wonder what the 3 of you think about the future of the plenipotentiary tribunal. The judges looked at each other. What else could the plenipotentiary court think of besides serving as a legal advisor to the nobles of the Palace of Versailles? Joseph continued to follow the temptation. If the Vezinier case is heard well this time, it may become a practice. In the future, trials involving judges, prosecutors, etc. will be handled by a full power court. The 3 people's eyes suddenly lit up. The oldest judge keenly grasped the key point of the Crown Prince's words and hurriedly said, Your Highness, how can a trial be considered outstanding? Joseph solemnly said, severely punish Vezinier and return justice to those who have been unfairly tried. You mean the retrial of the cases he handled? Joseph nodded. The case must be closed as soon as possible and the sentence must be harsh. Several judges briefly looked at the files of those cases, and some people immediately asked, Your Highness, many of those cases were from many years ago, and there is also a large amount of missing evidence. Joseph smiled coldly. Did Vezinier care about the evidence when he judged those cases? The oldest judge reacted immediately, nodded and said, Your Highness, we know what to do. Joseph comforted several people and said, Vezinier is now a symbol of sin. Everyone hopes that he will die immediately. No one will care about anything unreasonable in the trial process. The Next day, the public trial of Vezinier continued in the square in front of the High Court. Victims of the unjust cases caused by Vezinier came to the scene, many of whom were picked up by merit. When the trial began, the thousands of citizens watching immediately fell silent. To everyone's expectation, in less than half an hour, the sentence of a case from 3 years ago was changed. The murderer who was acquitted at the time was to be recaptured, and Vezinier was charged with accepting bribes, harboring criminals, and tampering with confessions. The crowd immediately burst into lasting cheers. The family members of the deceased in that case were already kneeling on the ground, crying and making the famous cross on their chests. The new book is on the shelves, begging for full subscription, monthly tickets, reviews, everything. The young author is grateful. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 96. Find You a Father. After the judge of the plenipotentiary tribunal pronounced the verdict, a palace official came out and showed everyone the order issued by His Majesty the King. The plenipotentiary tribunal was responsible for trying all cases involving Vezinier. People immediately burst into cheers again. The right to judge. The all-powerful court has the right to judge. Long live His Majesty the King. Long live France. God bless the people of France. Severely punish the shameless judge. High Court judges watched from a building behind. In the past, such an order that interfered with the power of trial would have been criticized by them, but at this moment, they could only hold their noses and admit it. The crowd was agitated outside, and anyone who dared to challenge the decision of the plenipotentiary court at this time would be immediately torn to pieces by the mob. Even though there were hundreds of police officers surrounding them, the judges all knew that even if they were torn into pieces, the police would not pay attention to them. The efficiency of the plenipotentiary court is very high. In one day, 6 old cases tried by Vezinier were overturned. The victims were all crying and shouting thank God and long live the king. Many of them were so excited that they fainted on the spot. No one cares about the crimes against Vezinier anymore. Anyway, there are already too many to count. The next day, the plenipotentiary tribunal retrieved all 11 cases involving Vezinier. In fact, it was originally planned to have more cases that needed to be retrieved, but some of the cases were relatively minor or the files had been lost. The judges of the plenipotentiary court strictly abided by the request of His Royal Highness the Crown Prince to conclude the cases as soon as possible, so they temporarily ignored such cases. 11 major cases are enough harsh sentences. In one case in particular, Vezinier was suspected of killing a witness in prison together with the defendant, and the murder was all blamed on Vezinier. The latter's lawyer never expressed any objection from beginning to end. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon that day, the oldest judge picked up the verdict, read a long paragraph about Vezinier's various crimes, and then loudly said, the sentences, beheading. The emotions of the onlookers erupted like a volcano in an instant. The cheers and applause continued for more than 10 minutes without stopping. Many people began to spontaneously run along the streets of Paris to spread the good news as soon as possible. Malher, who was sitting on the windowsill of a shop in the distance, raised his right hand, jumped down, patted his pants and snorted, "It's actually beheading? Humph. That kind of guy only deserves to be hanged." At present, the guillotine, as a relatively less painful method of death, can only be enjoyed by nobles, and people with low status can only be sentenced to hanging. At the Paris Merchant newspaper office, as soon as Denick got the news that Vezinier had been sentenced to beheading, he followed Joseph's instructions in advance, took out the manuscript he had prepared, and started to call the workers for printing. The front page headline of Paris Business Times is: the High Court has too much power. Who should supervise it? The front page of news and pictures read: the High Court interferes in government affairs, causing great harm. At the same time, Marat, Desmoulins and others were also writing press releases as quickly as possible, including the details of Vezinier's case, discussions on why the High Court was completely corrupted, and the positive role of the Royal Court of Plenipotentiary. These manuscripts were then sent to various newspapers. Now the High Court is in chaos, which has led to the suspension of the news review agency under its jurisdiction. The newspapers are almost unsupervised, and any news can be published in this way. Under the overwhelming bombardment of public opinion, almost everyone in Paris was talking about the High Court. The crowd protesting at the entrance of the court has been greatly reduced, but nearly 100 people still gathered there, demanding strict investigation of the judges except Versailles soon. Even the Palace of Versailles was abuzz with discussions about the High Court and the Versailles case. After Joseph waited for the public opinion to ferment, he and Brian went to see Queen Mary, preparing to knock the last nail on the coffin of the High Court. In the tea room, the Queen first praised Brian. "Archbishop Brian, your outstanding and productive work has brought hope to the country's finances. I must express my gratitude for your efforts on the tax bill." She had seen Brian 3 times recently, and each time she had to praise him in different ways. It was also because she had been too stifled by the bill before. Brian hurriedly leaned over and said, "I'm honored to do something within my ability for the great France. In fact, the passage of this bill is mostly due to His Royal Highness the Crown Prince." Queen Mary smiled and nodded, just thinking that he was flattering the Crown Prince. She believed that her son should have played a big role in this matter, but after all, he was still just a teenager, so it was definitely Brian, the veteran, who made the real plans. Joseph winked at Brian, who hurriedly handed the bill to the Queen. "Your Majesty, this is a new bill drafted by the Minister and His Royal Highness the Crown Prince. Please take a look at it." Queen Mary took the pages of the document, opened it, and asked curiously, "What is it about?" Brian hurriedly said, "Recently, public opinion has very much recognized the role played by the Royal Court of Plenipotentiary in the trial of the Versailles case. I believe that the Court of Plenipotentiary can play a very good supervisory role on the High Court to prevent similar cases. The case has resurfaced." Queen Mary looked through the bill in her hand and saw that the main content was to give the omnipotent court the power to supervise the High Court. Specifically, it included the ability to conduct a series of operations such as search, review, prosecution, and judgment on the High Court. It is also recommended that the Crown Court Plenipotentiary be renamed the Crown Court of Supreme Court to show that it is the superior department of the High Court. In addition, the bill also mentions that because the High Court interferes too much in administrative affairs, it will cancel its management of the news review agency so that the court can focus on judicial matters. Queen Mary couldn't help but raise the corners of her mouth. The High Court had oppressed her for so long, and it would be great if it could be assigned a higher level department. However, she immediately became worried. "Archbishop Brian, your bill is also to be submitted to the High Court for registration. How could they agree to this arrangement?" Joseph smiled slightly and said, "As long as you sign the bill, I guarantee that the High Court will pass it." The Queen looked at her son in surprise, then at Brian, and seeing that both of them looked confident, she immediately picked up a pen and signed her name, and then asked the clerk to take it to Louis XVI to sign and seal it. Paris Superior Court. In the conference room on the 3rd floor, 5 important members stared at the bills in front of them, most of them with gloomy expressions. This bill puts a noose around the neck of the High Court. The rope is held in the hands of the Royal Court of Plenipotentiary, now called the Royal Court of Supremacy. If the other party pulls it casually, he will be suffocated. Justice Louis, who had a hooked nose, slammed the table hard and gritted his teeth. "This kind of bill will never be registered." Chapter 97. A lot of pressure. Dubois sighed, but did not refute Louis. They were united in their opposition to the Supreme Court. However, the situation is stronger than the people. He glanced out the door. The representative of the Supreme Court was in the opposite room. He shook his head and said, "But no one wants to be like Count Versailles." Before he finished speaking, several dignitaries and congressmen shrank their pupils. Someone from the Supreme Court just brought a message, saying that in response to the strong demands of the people of Paris, His Majesty the King is considering retrialing all major cases handled by the High Court. In recent years there is systemic corruption within the High Court, which means that, as long as you are a judge here, you cannot avoid being involved in corruption. There. But are as unclean as Versailles, and they can't stop the retrial. The public in Paris is currently agitated. As long as the people of the Supreme Court shout outside, thousands of people can be summoned to surround the court immediately, just like what happened to Versailles. After a while, it was Dibble who took the lead, raising his hand feebly and saying solemnly, "Register it," as, for his position, there is one difference from that of several other judges. That is that people from the Supreme Court told him that after the bill is passed, they will fully support him as the president of the High Court. Of course, this was also Joseph's signal. The more we deal with this kind of opponent who seems to be at the end of his rope, the more we must insist on fighting one faction and the other, to prevent them from being defeated. Therefore, for Dibble, although the power of the High Court will be greatly restricted in the future, his personal power can be compensated by the position of president, which can be reluctantly accepted. Judge Wadi aside and raised his right hand. "I agree. Let it end as soon as possible." Gretel and Aurel had no choice but to raise their hands just like that. The judges pinched their noses and passed the bill giving the Crown Court the power to supervise the High Court. As for the clause at the end of the bill that removes the High Court's power to regulate news censorship agencies, they didn't even pay much attention to it. If the cow is dead, who will care about the few cow hairs on the ground? The most surprising thing is that this very important bill did not stir up any waves in the aristocratic circle. From the point of view of the nobles, it seems that nothing has changed, whether the High Court is still the High Court, or the Conference of Notables is still the Conference of Notables. Oh, an extra royal court? Isn't that the former royal plenipotentiary court, which has existed for hundreds of years? What was very different from the indifferent reaction of the nobles was that ordinary people in Paris seemed extremely excited. The grievances they had accumulated for many years against the High Court were vented on Versailles for several days in a row. People could be heard shouting on the streets, "Long live the king! Long live the plenipotentiary court! Execute the shameless judge!" Especially those victims of Versailles. They preached the king's benevolence and wisdom everywhere, and convened a plenipotentiary court to punish the villains. Soon, under the leadership of the Paris merchant, articles such as His Majesty the Great King's Glorious Victory and His Majesty the King's Just Judgment began to appear in various newspapers in Paris for the first time. Negative public opinion about the royal family has changed. Palace of Versailles. Joseph was not surprised to learn that the bill regarding the Supreme Court had been passed. Given the current trend, the High Court has no choice but to accept the bill. However, the lack of constraints from the High Court in the future made him feel a lot more relaxed, and he could finally show off his talents and do more important things. When he mentioned important things, he immediately thought of the imminent famine and couldn't help feeling dizzy. Again, there are more than 20 million people in France, and the food gap is calculated as 30%, which is also an extremely terrifying number. And he remembered that the food shortages would last until early 1790. Joseph looked at the falling snowflakes outside the tall arched floor-to-ceiling window. It was now the end of the snow month, which was mid-January in the Gregorian calendar. There are still 6.5 months before the large-scale famine breaks out in July. Where will we get so much food from? He had some ideas before, but the closer he got to the problem, the more he felt it was not enough. For example, if you want to buy from abroad, you will need a large amount of funds. With France's current financial situation, there is simply no spare money to buy so much food. Moreover, to store so much grain storage institutions are needed, and grain grabbing must be prevented during the most difficult times. Judging from what he has recently learned about the grain market, purchasing from foreign countries alone is not enough to fill the gap in France. This is under the premise that the grain market is always stable. If profiteers take advantage of it, the gap will be even greater. As for preventing hail in advance, historical data records that this year's hail is as big as an adult's fist. Unless all dealers wear steel armor, it will be impossible to prevent it. Joseph thought about France's financial situation from the funds to buy grain. He hadn't taken over financial affairs before, so he didn't feel it so obvious, but now the more than 2 billion yuan was like a mountain pressing on his chest, and it made him breathless just thinking about it. The Paris Angels that I have worked hard for a long time are now all packed up and sold. And they are only worth 10 million livres at most. In other words, 200 Paris Angels will be needed to plug this big hole. He couldn't help but take a deep breath to make his chest feel more comfortable. Therefore, if we want to solve the debt problem, we must fall back on the Industrial Revolution. On the one hand, using the massive industrial products produced by the Industrial Revolution can obtain huge economic benefits and directly fill the financial gap. On the other hand, the Industrial Revolution can also promote a substantial increase in national strength, thereby obtaining greater benefits in wars and overseas colonies, and then feeding back industry, forming a positive cycle. In fact, the United Kingdom also experienced a serious debt crisis in the early 19th century. The situation was no better than that of France today. However, they relied on the dividends of the Industrial Revolution and successfully solved the dilemma despite being burdened with huge debts. Joseph held up the warm teacup and took a sip. If he wanted to engage in industry, he must first gain control of the country's industrial policy. He couldn't help but shook his head. France didn't even have a Ministry of Industry at the moment, and the Minister of the Interior was also in charge of industry. It would be damning if someone like Monad could successfully carry out the Industrial Revolution. But fortunately, I have recently picked up a few more cards, and I can try to reconcile them with Mono, and ask him to give up the industrial part. At night. There is always a ball at the Palace of Versailles. Joseph bravely moved around among a large group of warblers and swallows, and finally squeezed into Mono's side, and hurriedly pulled him back. The young girls thought that His Royal Highness the Crown Prince was going to invite some girl to dance, but at this moment they saw him holding the Minister of the Interior's arm tightly, with strange looks on their faces. The new book is on the shelves, begging for full subscription, monthly tickets, reviews, everything. The young author is grateful. Chapter 98. Don't bully the old and the poor. Mono watched the warblers glaring at him angrily, and bowed to Joseph with some embarrassment. Your Highness, aren't you going to dance? Joseph said, I don't have time to dance. I have something serious to tell you. Mono glanced at the people dancing happily around him again. You mean, here, talking about business? Joseph thought to himself, I would rather sit on the sofa and drink tea and chat slowly, but after looking for you all afternoon, even your servants don't know where you have gone. I went to see you this afternoon. Oh. Mono touched the tip of his nose in embarrassment. He didn't want anyone to know about the little things he had with Countess Messe. He hurriedly dragged the Crown Prince to a slightly secluded corner. Please tell me. Joseph thought for a while and said, simply put, I want to do something that promotes industry, and that is currently managed by your Home Office. Mono blinked his little eyes and nodded. Let's be honest, I want you to give up your jurisdiction over industry. Mono still nodded, waiting for the Crown Prince's exchange of interests. Joseph said, now, news review is no longer under the control of the High Court. I think a press and publication bureau can be established to take charge of these things and leave it to you to manage. In addition, I have discussed with Archbishop Brian to promulgate a patent law. He roughly explained the meaning of the patent law, and then said, corresponding to this, a patent office must be established, and this can also be left to you. Monad made some calculations in his mind. France's industry is no match for Britain's. It is currently in a state of half-death, and there is no point in holding it in his own hands. The patent office that the prince mentioned seems to be pretty good, and there will definitely be some benefits to him if he can establish a relationship with fashion design or something like that. It's just a news review, but it doesn't seem to be of any use. He then showed a simple and honest smile. Your Highness, look. Joseph didn't wait for him to be verbose, and immediately said, at a printing workshop. I have a technology that can reduce the cost of printing pictures to less than 1/5 of what it is now. We can invest 200,000 livres. Oh, of course, you will mainly pay for this money, and you can monopolize printing in almost all Paris. Business, you and I each hold 20% of the shares, and the Press and Publication Bureau holds 60%, and the profits in the first 7 years belong to you. The printing workshop that Joseph wanted to build was actually a means of controlling pamphlets. Anyone who wants to publish a brochure must come to me to print it. Otherwise the price will be much higher than other brochures, resulting in no one interested. And if you come to me to print, haha, this printing workshop is linked to the Press and Publication Bureau. You go there first and pass the review. After Mono repeatedly confirmed that this cheap Printing technology had been put into use. He immediately showed a bright smile and nodded. "Oh, you are always so generous, Your Majesty the Crown Prince. May God bless you." In the royal workshop, His Majesty the King of France, who had been busy for most of the day, put the musket in his hand on the workbench, wiped his sweat, and prepared to enjoy his dinner. While the servants were taking off his apron, he picked up the newspaper on the side. Servants would bring more influential newspapers every day, and immediately saw the eye-catching title, "The Glorious Victory of His Majesty the Great King." He scratched his head. He had been spending time in the workshop thinking about making guns, so how could he suddenly achieve a glorious victory? He changed a newspaper. The front page read, "His Majesty brings justice to his loyal Paris." Louis XVI hurriedly put his glasses on the bridge of his nose and read the newspaper carefully. Only then did he know the reason for the bill on the Royal Supreme Court that he signed 2 days ago. He put down the newspaper, puffed up his chest proudly, and thought to himself, "It seems that handling national affairs is not that complicated. Well, didn't I do a pretty good job?" In front of the Golden Gate of the conference hall of the East Palace of Versailles, Joseph, wearing a burgundy dress, puffed out his chest, passed between 2 rows of guards who bowed their heads in salute, and strode into the conference hall. This was the first time he couldn't wait to get in here. Not long after, all the cabinet ministers arrived, and Queen Mary came earlier than usual. Everyone saluted. The golden door creaked shut, and the cabinet meeting officially began. Archbishop Brian looked around at everyone with a happy face, and then talked about the tax bill matter-of-factly. "After the passage of this bill, it will greatly alleviate the country's financial difficulties." He opened the documents he had prepared. "The land tax alone is expected to increase fiscal revenue by 18 million livres every year. The stamp duty is expected to increase." After he finished reading eloquently, he glanced at Salmier, who had a gloomy face, and concluded, "Combining the above various taxes, the annual fiscal revenue will increase by 22 million to 24 million livres in the future." Queen Mary took the lead in applauding and nodding. This will be a memorable day in France's fiscal history. Whether they were happy or not, all the ministers applauded and congratulated Brian. After talking about the tax bill, Brian changed a document, bowed to the Queen, and then said loudly, "Then let's move on to the first topic." Count Munn had suggested that Count Samuel was responsible for the scandal in the judicial system, and was no longer fit to serve as Minister of Justice. Samuel lowered his head, glanced at Mono quickly, and then stared at the brass penholder in front of him without saying a word. He knew that the impact of Vezinier's incident was too great this time, and as the Minister of Justice, he would certainly not be able to escape accountability for lax supervision. Moreover, he had impeached Brian back then, and Brian would definitely not miss the opportunity for revenge this time. The Duke of Orleans also expected that Samuel would be impeached, and was prepared to do his best to keep his political ally. He stood up, coughed slightly, and said, "Your Majesty the Queen, as far as I know, Vezinier is extremely cautious every time he accepts a bribe, and it is difficult for outsiders to detect it. Although Salmier neglects supervision, he dismissed cabinet ministers, just for this one judge. Is it?" Joseph sneered from the side. "The Duke of Orleans is really eloquent. First of all, Vezinier did not just accept bribes. You can read his verdict. Secondly, I'm afraid that Vezinier is not the only judge with problems in the High Court. How about we continue to investigate? He is not afraid of destroying the High Court. Anyway, it is 1/3 of an acre of land belonging to the aristocratic group. If it is destroyed, it will be convenient for him to start a new one. Sure enough, the Duke of Orleans' face turned red from suppressing it, but he didn't dare to answer the question at all. In order to avoid investigation, those in the High Court have even admitted it to the Royal High Court. If they continue to interfere, they may become the public enemy of the judges. Upon seeing this, Brian immediately pushed the dismissal document he had prepared in front of Queen Mary and said respectfully, "Your Majesty, please make your decision." Seeing that the ministers were unanimous in their opinions, the Queen immediately comforted Sumaya, and then signed the document. Brian put the documents away with satisfaction, looked at Samuel, raised his hand, and gestured towards the golden door. "Count Samuel, please stay away, thanks." 2. Wu Qiang, the king of spoons. And don't come close to sugar and fats, 2 big guys, for generously tipping this book. Cheyenne Haitian is grateful. I love you all. Chapter 99. A meeting belonging to the Crown Prince. Sumail suddenly felt that the entire conference hall was filled with an aura of humiliation. He was so angry that his whole body was shaking, but he had no choice but to stand up angrily and walk out of the hall with a dark face. After the golden door closed again, Queen Mary sighed softly, looked at Brian and said, Archbishop Brian, who do you think is more suitable to succeed the Minister of Justice? Brian immediately said, Your Majesty, the current palace advisor, Baron Breteuil, is capable and loyal. He studied law at the University of Paris. He can be appointed as the Minister of Justice. This is also the result of repeated weighings between Joseph and Brian. Bretty is good at communication and has good political abilities, and most importantly, he is the king's cousin and very loyal to the royal family. Historically, at the most dangerous moment when Louis XVI was preparing to flee Paris, he was planning for the king and never betrayed him. Queen Mary nodded. Please ask him to meet me later. Okay, Your Majesty. Joseph glanced at Foreign Minister Vilsin without leaving any trace. The next target is him. After getting rid of Versin, it will be equivalent to pulling out all the political teeth of the evil tiger Duke of Orleans. Brian picked up the document again and read the second issue. In view of the fact that the High Court has given up its power to censor news, His Royal Highness the Crown Prince proposed to establish the Press and Publication Bureau to manage news censorship matters. The Duke of Orleans snorted coldly, lowered his head, and said nothing with a sullen face. He has been completely defeated in the recent pamphlet war, and now that he has lost his right to censor news, he no longer needs to think about controlling public opinion. In the past 20 minutes, he first lost an important political ally, and then his hegemony of public opinion was shattered. Today's cabinet meeting was simply a nightmare for him. Well, this is very good. Queen Mary nodded very happily. Ever since she married in France, she has been constantly smeared by public opinion. Today, she can finally clear up the clouds. Brian gestured to Monad. The responsibilities of the Press and Publication Bureau are closest to internal affairs, so I suggest that Count Monad be responsible for managing it. Mono immediately caressed the Queen's chest and said, Your Majesty, I will definitely make those vulgar and shameless articles completely disappear from the world. Queen Mary showed a satisfied smile, praised Monad a few words, and immediately signed the document. Brian continued. The third issue. His Royal Highness the Crown Prince submitted a report, believing that after the signing of the Treaty of Eden, France's interests were greatly damaged, especially in the textile, steel and other industries, which were almost unable to continue operating. So, His Highness suggested that the UK-France trade negotiations should be restarted as soon as possible, and the content of the treaty should be revised to avoid the situation from deteriorating further. The Duke of Orleans felt that he finally had a chance to fight back and immediately sneered. Your Highness, I'm afraid you think too simply. Britain has gained a lot of benefits from the treaty. How can it possibly agree to amend the treaty? Joseph glanced at him, bowed to the Queen and said, Your Majesty, I'm absolutely sure that I can convince the British before the Queen could ask questions. He added, even if the negotiation may not work out, we should give it a try. After all, we won't have anything to lose. All cabinet ministers except the Duke of Orleans, including Versin, immediately agreed. Several of them were either Joseph's political allies or stacker holders. How could they disagree? Queen Mary also nodded slightly and asked, Archbishop Brian, have you made preparations for the specific negotiation terms? Brian immediately placed a document in front of her. Yes, Your Majesty, these are our established negotiation goals. The core content is twofold. First, strive to get the UK to reduce import tariffs on alcohol, including wine, beer, and spirits, to less than 10%. The minister, who learned about the contents of this negotiation for the first time, was immediately full of expectations. Liquor, especially wine, is the main export pillar of France, but it currently faces fierce competition from Spain, Tuscany, Venice and other places. If the UK can really reduce France's wine import tariffs alone, The competitiveness of French wine will be greatly improved. Brian continued. The second is to increase our imports on industrial products to 25%, but then reduce it by 3% every year, until it is reduced to 5% in 7 years. The foreign minister immediately stood up and objected. 5%? Absolutely not. This will completely deprive France's industry of protection. Joseph smiled and said, even according to the current 12% tariff, our industry is no match for the British. It would be better to let those workshops take a breath and change industries as soon as possible, which can reduce losses. Besides, only by significantly reducing tariffs on industrial products can the British reduce tariffs on alcohol. Naturally, he would not mention the rapid improvement of France's industrial capabilities. After all, there is still the Guyolians present. The Queen looked at Brian hesitantly. Archbishop, do you think so too? Yes, Your Majesty. This is the most beneficial way for us at the moment. Brian was actually at a loss, but based on his absolute trust in the Crown Prince, he still chose to support these terms. Other negotiations include Britain and France jointly forming a joint fleet to combat smuggling. Everyone was stunned when they heard this, thinking that there was something wrong with their ears. Britain and France form a combined fleet. Why does it sound so magical? And this is the effect Joseph wanted. The British would regard this as a symbol of France giving up maritime hegemony, and combating smuggling would be more beneficial to France. The British industrial products that are smuggled into France every year have dealt a heavy blow to the French industry, because the smuggled products are equivalent to zero tariffs and the price is much cheaper than those produced in France. And if this article is negotiated, it will be equivalent to using the British fleet to protect French industry. Britain gains face, and France gains dignity, so why not? Brian continued. There is also a requirement that Britain sell £1 million of cheap wool to the port of Le Havre every year. Since France's defeat in the 7 Years' War, it has lost a large number of overseas colonies, resulting in a shortage of wool, which is very detrimental to the development of the textile industry. Of course, Joseph was not sure whether the British would be so generous, but after all, everyone has united the fleet. Why can't you, the British, express your gratitude? If you don't have £1 million, at least give me £500,000. After discussing the trade negotiations, Brian continued to read out the next topic. His Royal Highness the Crown Prince proposed to introduce the patent law and the company law, because these two bills were urgently needed by the capital aristocracy to develop industrial industries, and had no harm to the old aristocracy and common people. Queen Mary signed the document very neatly, and ordered it to be taken to His Majesty the King for signature. As for the High Court, not to mention that they had no reasons to reject the two bills. Even if they had, under the gaze of the Royal High Court, they could only register the bills obediently. Thanks to Mr. Gunman, a small official, for the generous reward of 1,500 starting coins for this book. The young author is grateful. Moi. Chapter 100. Meeting a thief at night. After a whole morning of cabinet meetings, several ministers looked tired. Queen Mary was about to announce a temporary adjournment of the meeting and continue after lunch when she heard Brian preemptively say, "There is one last topic." The Queen sighed inwardly, and her buttocks, that had just lifted half an inch, fell back to the chair. Brian looked at Monad. Count Monad believes that given the current poor state of textile, steel, glass and other industries, dedicated personnel should be set up to manage these industries in order to reverse the situation. Queen Mary was too tired to think anymore and asked the Chief Minister directly, "Archbishop Brian, what do you think should be done? This matter has been discussed long ago." Brian immediately said, "Your Majesty, I suggest that we set up an industrial planning bureau to be responsible for the above mentioned industries. Count Monad will no longer have to take care of these things and can save energy to better conduct news review." The Queen felt that it was not a big deal and nodded. "So, who do you think should be in charge of this department?" Joseph had been waiting for this sentence and stood up and said, "Your Majesty, leave it to me." "Well, this should be a good training opportunity." Palais Royal. The Duke of Orleans looked at the British ambassador to France with great confusion. "You mean, you have already communicated with the Crown Prince about trade negotiations?" "Indeed." Hartley smiled and nodded. So, do you know what he said at the cabinet meeting? The Duke of Orleans showed a mocking look. He wants the UK to lower the tariff on wine imported from France to less than 10%. Haha, he is simply joking. Hartley hesitated for a moment, then said truthfully, Your Majesty, as far as I know, the British Parliament has agreed to this request in principle, and asked me to finalize the negotiation time with your country as soon as possible. The Duke of Orleans was stunned. How can you agree to such conditions? As he was talking, he suddenly heard the guard shouting from outside the door, Catch him. He ran that way. Some people go to the corridor and block him. Got, he's like a cunning squirrel. Be careful. His swordsmanship is very powerful. The butler quickly pushed the door open and quickly locked the door. Then he said to the Duke of Orleans, Master, a thief has slipped in. The guards are rounding up him. You are safe here. The Duke of Orleans frowned, but he was not surprised. There were many people of all kinds coming to the royal palace every day, and it was easy for thieves to sneak in. But he was a little curious. There had been so much noise just now, but the guards hadn't caught the thief yet. Not long after, a guard knocked on the door and came in panting. Reporting to the housekeeper, the latter hurriedly said to the Duke of Orleans, Sir, it seems that the thief stole something from your document room and just ran out of the royal palace. This damn guy. Orleans suddenly darkened his face. There was a lot of important information in the document room, but it was heavily guarded. Why did it get stolen by a thief? He immediately ordered, Send more manpower, and be sure to catch him. Yes, sir. Soon, more than 100 fully armed guards filed out of the royal palace and disappeared into the last ray of sunlight at dusk. 5 carriages were running quickly on the white stone pavement of Rue Saint-Honoré in Paris. This is the Crown Prince's moving convoy. Yes, Joseph found that, after taking over industrial management, he had too many things to do. If he traveled between Paris and Versailles every day, a lot of time would be wasted. So he simply bought a house in the Louvre area of Paris as the office location of the French Industrial Planning Bureau. Then I moved all my daily necessities and office supplies over here and prepared to live here permanently. On the carriage, Joseph was silently thinking about how to get a large food fund in a short time. He had roughly calculated before that, based on a 30% food gap, even if food prices did not fluctuate, at least 60 million livres of food would have to be purchased to barely survive. 1788. This does not include expenses such as building granaries and losses. As for 1789, it was probably difficult to buy food even abroad. After all, this was a global climate anomaly, and large-scale famines occurred from Europe to Asia. And if the problem of famine cannot be solved, the hungry people will have no choice but to take their lives. Joseph first thought of a loan, but with the current financial reputation of the French government, it would be very difficult to borrow so much money in a short period of time. And even if you can get a loan, the interest rate will definitely be exorbitantly high. The second is to issue public bonds. Forget it, the finance minister has already sold the public bonds that can be sold and will not keep them for himself. If you want to make money by engaging in new technologies or the like, you won't be able to make so much money because you don't have enough time. Therefore, you have to make quick money and you have to make big money. While his brain was overclocking, he suddenly heard the blast of muskets in the distance, followed by the noise of people, and the carriage suddenly slowed down. After a while, a guard reported outside the car window, Your Highness, it seems that we are catching a thief ahead. Catching thieves? You fired so many shots. Joseph was a little surprised. Is it a gang of thieves? No, Your Highness, the guard said. It is said that there is only one person. One person can cause such a big fight? Joseph asked again, Are the police arresting you? The guard shook his head. They are the guards of the royal palace, Your Highness. The Duke of Orleans. Several more gunshots were heard in the distance, and Emin quickly ordered the driver to retreat and stay away from this place of right and wrong. Just as the motorcade turned into the alley next to it, a black figure suddenly jumped down from the roof on the right. The black shadow's hands and feet continuously used force on the window edge to slow down. Taking advantage of the moment when the carriage passed by, he suddenly raised his hand to smash open the window and then jumped into the car like lightning. He put his left hand on the small wooden table in the car and quickly regained his body balance. At the same time, through the candlelight, he confirmed that there were only 2 people in the car, and one of them was a young man who posed no threat. He moved very quickly. As soon as his feet were in place, his right hand pulled out a short knife from his waist and slashed at the blonde man in the car. He did not intend to kill anyone, but was preparing to hold the man hostage with a knife in order to threaten him and lead him out of the siege point. However, his sword had just been swung less than a finger away when a cold light flashed in the hand of the man in front of him, and a short sword was already pressed against his throat point. The blonde man said solemnly, "Don't move, otherwise you will die." The black shadow froze, and the short knife in his hand was taken away by the blonde man. Guard. The blonde man was about to call someone, but the young man sitting opposite raised his hand to stop him, and then asked the man in black who broke in, "Were the people from the royal palace chasing you just now?" End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.